In the bleak darkness of the 41st millennium, even the most devout servants of the Imperium can fall prey to corruption. Such was the case with Cardinal Xaphan, whose tale of ambition and heresy would forever mark the world of Vraks Prime with blood and betrayal. Xaphan's rise within the ecclesiarchy had been methodical and unremarkable for many decades. Born to a noble family on Gathalammer, he showed early promise as a charismatic orator and diligent student of Imperial doctrine. His advancement through the ranks of the Adeptus Munitorum followed a predictable trajectory: acolyte, deacon, priest, and eventually, bishop. Each promotion came through a combination of political acumen, demonstrated piety, and carefully cultivated connections with influential patrons within the church hierarchy. In 804th year of the 41st millennium, the appointment that would change the fate of millions arrived. Xaphan was elevated to the prestigious position of Cardinal Astral of the Scaras sector. This vast ecclesiastical territory in the Segmentum Obscurus placed tremendous power in his hands, spiritual authority over billions of Imperial citizens across dozens of worlds. The appointment came with oversight of numerous shrine worlds, missionary outposts, and ecclesiarchy holdings, including the strategically vital fortress world of Vraks Prime. Vraks Prime itself was no glorious center of Imperial culture or faith. Rather, it was a bleak, windswept world of continental fortifications and subterranean storage facilities. Its significance lay in its function, a massive Adeptus Munitorum supply depot that served as the logistics hub for Imperial military operations throughout the sector. Vast underground complexes housed stockpiles of weapons, ammunition vehicles, and equipment sufficient to supply a dozen Imperial Guard crusades. The world's natural geography had been enhanced with concentric rings of defense, trenches, bunkers, artillery emplacements, and void shield generators, creating a virtually impregnable fortress. The planet's strategic value could not be overstated. From Vraks, the Adeptus Munitorum could rapidly deploy war materiel to any conflict zone in the sector. Its massive stockpiles included everything from lasguns and flak armor to Leman Russ battle tanks and basilisk artillery pieces. The fortress world also housed numerous Mechanicus repair facilities, munitions factories, and training grounds for the planetary defense forces. In the event of a major campaign, Vraks could serve as a staging point for multiple Imperial Guard regiments, providing them with equipment and provisions before deployment to the front lines. Cardinal Xaphan's corruption did not occur overnight. The first signs were subtle: a growing obsession with personal authority, increased isolation from his peers, and a tendency to interpret Imperial doctrine in increasingly radical ways. His sermons began to emphasize themes of purification through suffering and the necessity of violent struggle against the Imperium's enemies. While such rhetoric was not entirely unusual for an ecclesiarchy cardinal, the intensity and frequency of these messages raised concerns among some of his subordinates. The cardinal's first significant act upon taking control of Vraks was to establish his personal headquarters within the formidable Citadel, a massive fortified complex that housed both the ecclesiarchy's administrative center and the Adeptus Munitorum's command structure. From this position, Xaphan could observe and gradually influence the operations of the vital supply depot. By 809, 5 years into his tenure, Xaphan had begun systematically replacing key personnel throughout the Vraksian administration, with individuals loyal to him personally rather than to the broader Imperial institutions. Adeptus Munitorum officials who questioned his growing authority were transferred off-world or disappeared entirely. The Adeptus Archives' presence on Vraks, never particularly robust given the world's specialized military function, found itself increasingly marginalized and confined to peripheral duties. The Cardinal's most consequential decision came in 812, when he issued a sector-wide proclamation calling for a pilgrimage to Vraks Prime. This unprecedented summons drew millions of the faithful from across the Scaras sector. The official purpose was to construct a grand shrine to Saint Leonis the Blind, an obscure Imperial saint with supposed connections to the sector's early history. In reality, this mass immigration provided Xaphan with something far more valuable than laborers. It gave him the foundation for a private army. The pilgrims who answered Xaphan's call came from all walks of life: impoverished hive-worlders seeking meaning, disaffected laborers from Forge worlds, veterans of Imperial Guard regiments, and even minor nobles looking to demonstrate their piety. All arrived on Vraks expecting to participate in a holy work. Instead, they found themselves gradually indoctrinated into what would become known as the disciples of Xaphan. The Cardinal's charisma proved particularly effective on these displaced masses. His sermons grew increasingly apocalyptic, speaking of an Imperium that had lost its way, of corruption among the nobility, and of the need for a purifying flame to cleanse the sector. Such rhetoric, while dangerously close to sedition, was carefully couched in terms of loyalty to the Emperor's original vision. Xaphan positioned himself not as a rebel, but as a reformer, a faithful servant working to restore the Imperium to its proper path. By 815, the transformation of the pilgrims into a military force had begun in earnest. Under the guise of defensive training, to protect the shrine construction, Xaphan's trusted lieutenants, many former Imperial Guard officers, established training camps throughout the Vraksian wastelands. The Adeptus Munitorum's vast arsenals provided an inexhaustible supply of weapons and equipment, all of which could be requisitioned through administrative channels now controlled by the Cardinal's loyalists. The disciples of Xaphan grew in both number and capability. What had begun as simple security details evolved into organized military units with standardized training, equipment, and chain of command. The Cardinal's personal guard, drawn from the most fanatical adherents, received enhanced weapons and armor diverted from Mechanicus workshops. 2 years later, these forces numbered in the millions, a fact carefully concealed from Imperial authorities through falsified population records and dispersed encampments. Throughout this period, the true extent of Xaphan's corruption remained invisible to most Imperial observers. His communications with sector authorities remained respectful and orthodox. Required tithes continued to flow from Vraks to the broader Imperium. Munitions and supplies were still dispatched to Imperial Guard forces when formally requested. To outward appearances, the Cardinal was simply an unusually active and involved administrator, perhaps excessively focused on his shrine project, but otherwise unremarkable. The reality, hidden behind the Citadel's massive walls, was far darker. By the year 819 of the 41st millennium, Xaphan had fallen fully under the influence of chaos, specifically the whispers of the Lord of Change, Tzeentch. The exact moment of his corruption remains unknown. Perhaps it began with the discovery of a forbidden text in the depths of the Citadel's archives, or through contact with a previously dormant chaos artifact unearthed during the shrine's construction. Whatever the catalyst, the Cardinal's transformation accelerated rapidly once the process began. The physical manifestations of this corruption remained largely concealed beneath his ecclesiastical robes and within his private chambers. His inner circle, however, was gradually exposed to the Cardinal's new beliefs, a twisted interpretation of Imperial faith that incorporated elements of chaos worship disguised as ancient and suppressed truths about the Emperor's plan. Many rejected these heresies and were eliminated. Those who accepted them formed the core of what would become the leadership of the Apostate Cardinal's rebellion. The fortification of the Citadel began under the pretext of enhancing security for the Shrine project. Existing defensive structures were reinforced, new weapon emplacements installed, and void shield generators upgraded with technology requisitioned from Mechanicus stores. These improvements, while substantial, were implemented gradually to avoid drawing attention from sector authorities. Each enhancement was justified through bureaucratic paperwork, citing potential threats from pirates, Xenos raiders, or other external enemies. By 821, the final pieces of Xaphan's plan were falling into place. The disciples had been organized into a functional army with a clear command structure. The Citadel had been transformed into a virtually impregnable fortress within an already heavily fortified world. Control over the Adeptus Munitorum's distribution networks ensured access to vast stockpiles of weapons and equipment. Most importantly, the Cardinal had identified and neutralized potential sources of resistance within the planet's administration. The strategic brilliance of Xaphan's position cannot be overstated. Vraks Prime was already designed to withstand external assault, with multiple defensive rings extending outward from the central citadel. These defenses, intended to protect the munition stockpiles from enemy attack, would now serve to keep Imperial forces at bay. The planet's location within the Scaras sector placed it far from major concentrations of Astartes chapters or significant naval battle groups, ensuring that any response to rebellion would require extensive mobilization and transit time. The final corruption of the ecclesiarchy authority on Vraks was completed through a combination of ideological subversion and brutal purges. Priests and deacons who demonstrated unwavering loyalty to Terra were gradually replaced with Xaphan's chosen appointees. Those who could not be removed through administrative means met with unfortunate accidents or disappeared during pilgrimages to remote shrine sites. By the time the Cardinal was ready to declare his open rebellion, the planet's entire ecclesiastical structure had been remade in his image. The subversion of the Adeptus Munitorum proved more challenging, but equally thorough. The logistical administrators who managed the vast supply depot were primarily concerned with efficiency and protocol rather than theological matters. Xaphan's approach here emphasized infiltration rather than conversion. Key positions were filled with individuals who appeared to be model Imperial servants, but whose true loyalty lay with the Cardinal. Supply records were systematically falsified to conceal the diversion of materials to the disciples. Inventory systems were compromised to hide the true extent of the weapons and equipment being stockpiled within the Citadel. In the closing days of 821, as his preparations neared completion, Xaphan made his final moves to secure control. The remaining loyal elements of the planetary defense forces were dispatched to remote outposts under the pretense of responding to potential threats, effectively removing them from the strategic equation. Communication arrays were placed under the direct control of the Cardinal's most trusted lieutenants, ensuring that no unauthorized messages could reach the wider Imperium. The small Adeptus Archives precinct, already marginalized and undermanned, was overwhelmed in a single night of coordinated violence. With these actions, Cardinal Xaphan completed his transformation from Imperial servant to apostate warlord. The fortress world of Vraks Prime, with its vast munition stockpiles, formidable defenses, and newly created army, stood ready to defy the Imperium that had created it. The stage was set for what would become one of the most grueling and bloody sieges in Imperial history, a conflict that would consume millions of lives and test the resolve of even the Emperor's finest warriors. Word of Cardinal Xaphan's treachery did not reach the highest echelons of Imperial authority immediately. The first indications of trouble came through routine administrative channels when the Adeptus Munitorum noted irregularities in supply requisition patterns from Vraks Prime. Scheduled shipments of munitions to frontline Imperial Guard regiments began arriving incomplete or not at all. Astropathic communications with the fortress world became increasingly delayed, garbled, or simply unanswered. By early 822, these inconsistencies could no longer be dismissed as administrative errors. The Adeptus Munitorum dispatched a senior logistical adept to investigate the situation personally. When his shuttle was denied landing clearance and subsequently fired upon by defense batteries that should have been under Imperial control, the truth became undeniable. Cardinal Xaphan had severed Vraks Prime from Imperial authority. The Adeptus Munitorum wasted no time in declaring the Vraksian secession an immediate strategic threat. The loss of the munitions stockpile alone represented an incalculable blow to Imperial military operations throughout the sector. More concerning was the possibility that Xaphan might distribute these weapons to other potential rebels or even Xeno's forces. The strategic location of Vraks as a linchpin in sector-wide defense could not be compromised. Within days of confirmation, the Adeptus Munitorum convened an emergency strategic assessment at their headquarters on Terra. Senior logisticians, military strategists, and representatives from the Adeptus Administratum pored over tactical maps and fortification schematics of Vraks. Their conclusion was sobering. Reclaiming the fortress world would require a massive commitment of Imperial Guard forces specializing in siege warfare. The nature of Vraks itself dictated the approach. The concentric rings of defenses, reinforced over centuries and designed to withstand prolonged assault, could not be overcome through conventional warfare. Airborne insertion was impossible due to the overlapping fields of anti-aircraft batteries. Orbital bombardment would risk destroying the very munition stockpiles the Imperium sought to reclaim. This would be a grinding siege of the old pattern: trench warfare, artillery barrages, and infantry assaults measured in meters gained rather than kilometers. For such a specialized campaign, only one Imperial Guard regiment truly excelled: the Death Korps of Krieg. Forged in the nuclear fire of their homeworld civil war, the Krieg regiments had spent centuries perfecting the art of siege warfare. Their unquestioning loyalty, willingness to sustain astronomical casualties, and expertise in trench fighting made them the optimal choice for what promised to be a protracted and bloody campaign. The Death Korps of Krieg originated from a world that had itself rebelled against the Imperium thousands of years earlier. The nuclear devastation that followed had transformed Krieg into a toxic wasteland where survival required rigorous discipline and specialized equipment. The planet's culture became centered around atonement for their ancestors' treason, an endless penance paid in blood on battlefields across the galaxy. Krieg regiments differed from standard Imperial Guard formations in several crucial aspects. Each soldier, clad in their distinctive greatcoat and respirator mask, viewed death in service to the Emperor as the ultimate purpose of their existence. They did not seek glory or victory for its own sake, but rather the opportunity to repay the debt their ancestors had incurred through rebellion. This mindset made them uniquely suited for the meat grinder tactics that siege warfare demanded. The Adeptus Munitorum's request for Krieg regiments was approved with unusual speed. The strategic importance of Vraks overrode the typical bureaucratic delays. Orders were dispatched to multiple Krieg mustering stations throughout the Segmentum Obscurus, redirecting regiments previously earmarked for other campaigns. Within months, a substantial force had been assembled under the command of Lord Commander Zwakel, an experienced officer with a reputation for methodical planning and unwavering resolve. Zwakel established his headquarters aboard the transport ship Emperor's Deliverance, while the assembled regiments were still in transit to Vraks. There, surrounded by tactical displays and fortification schematics, he drafted what would become known as the 12-year plan, a comprehensive strategy for the reclamation of Vraks Prime. The document outlined a phased approach to breaking through each defensive ring, with realistic assessments of the time and casualties each phase would require. The plan called for the establishment of the 88th Siege Army, a specialized formation comprised entirely of Death Korps regiments. This would include infantry regiments, artillery regiments, engineer corps, and armored companies, all trained in the specialized tactics of siege warfare. Zwakel estimated a total force requirement of 34 regiments to sustain the operation through its projected 12-year duration, accounting for anticipated casualties and necessary rotation of units. The 88th Siege Army's order of battle reflected the unique requirements of the campaign. Heavy emphasis was placed on artillery formations, with multiple regiments of Earthshaker cannons, Medusa siege guns, and Bombard heavy mortars. Engineer regiments were assigned to construct the extensive trench networks that would be necessary to advance across the blasted wastelands between Vraks' defensive rings. Infantry regiments were equipped with specialized gear for trench fighting, shotguns, grenades, and close combat weapons that would prove vital in the confined spaces of bunker assaults. Lord Commander Zwakel's plan divided the siege into 9 distinct phases, each focusing on breaking through one of Vraks' defensive rings or securing critical objectives. The first phase, estimated to require 18 months, would establish the initial landing zones and create a secure perimeter from which subsequent operations could be launched. Each following phase accounted for the increasing difficulty as Imperial forces approached the heavily fortified central citadel where Cardinal Xaphan had established his headquarters. The plan was remarkable not for its creativity, but for its brutal pragmatism. Zwakel made no attempt to disguise the cost in lives the operation would demand. His casualty projections numbered in the millions, figures that would have been considered unconscionable for most Imperial Guard formations, but were accepted without question by the Death Korps command. To the Krieg regiments, such losses were not merely expected, but embraced as the necessary price of redemption. In early 813, the first wave of the 88th Siege Army arrived in the Vraks system. The fleet of transport ships, protected by a modest naval escort, achieved orbit without significant resistance. Cardinal Xaphan, lacking substantial void assets, had chosen to concentrate his forces on the ground defenses where his advantages were greatest. This strategic decision allowed the Imperial forces to establish orbital superiority quickly, though the planet's extensive anti-aircraft batteries prevented them from capitalizing on this advantage beyond secure landing operations. The initial landings occurred at 3 predetermined sites equidistant around Vraks' primary defensive perimeter. These locations, designated landing zones Solaris, Memento, and Ferox, were selected based on detailed analysis of the planet's defensive coverage. Each represented a relative weak point in the outer defensive ring, where artillery coverage was less concentrated, and the terrain offered some natural protection for establishing a foothold. Landing Zone Solaris, positioned in the Northern Hemisphere, was assigned to the 158th and 163rd Siege Regiments. Their drop pods and landing craft descended through carefully plotted approach vectors to minimize exposure to anti-aircraft fire. Even with these precautions, the landing suffered approximately 22% casualties before troops could establish ground positions. The regiments immediately deployed prefabricated bunkers and began excavating the first trench lines, while Earthshaker batteries were assembled to counter enemy artillery. Landing Zone Memento in the Eastern Hemisphere faced stiffer resistance. The 149th Siege Regiment found their designated landing area heavily reinforced by Xaphan's forces, suggesting a security leak had compromised their plans. Adapting quickly, Death Korps commanders redirected their landing craft to a secondary position 5 kilometers to the north. This improvisation saved the initial wave, but delayed the establishment of artillery positions critical to the defensive perimeter. For 3 days, the regiment endured constant bombardment before their own guns could be brought to bear. Landing Zone Ferox in the Southern Hemisphere proved the most successful of the initial landings. The 143rd Siege Regiment achieved surprise by approaching through a severe electromagnetic storm that disrupted enemy targeting systems. Exploiting this advantage, they secured a perimeter twice the expected size and captured several intact enemy artillery positions. These guns were immediately turned against their former owners, providing crucial fire support during the vulnerable early hours of the landing operation. As each landing zone secured its immediate perimeter, the second wave of the 88th Siege Army began its descent. Heavy equipment that could not be accommodated in the initial assault craft now arrived in massive landers. Leman Russ battle tanks, Basilisk artillery pieces, Trojan support vehicles, and the massive Hades breaching drills that would prove essential in penetrating Vraks' fortified bunker networks. The Logistics Corps established supply dumps, ammunition depots, and field hospitals in standardized patterns that reflected centuries of Krieg siege doctrine. The Death Korps' approach to establishing defensive positions reflected their unique regimental culture. Each trench was dug to precise specifications, 2 meters deep, 1 meter wide, with firing steps positioned every 5 meters. Reinforced bunkers were constructed at strategic intervals, each capable of withstanding direct hits from all but the heaviest artillery. Communication trenches connected the forward positions to command bunkers and artillery observation posts. The entire network expanded outward from the landing zones in a methodical pattern that prioritized defensibility over speed of advance. Within weeks, the characteristic landscape of a Krieg siege had transformed the terrain around each landing zone. Endless trench networks stretched toward the enemy positions, while behind them rose the prefabricated structures of field headquarters, munitions depots, and vehicle parks. Death Korps quartermasters established the logistical systems that would sustain the army through years of grinding warfare, ammunition resupply lines, ration distribution centers, and the somber casualty processing facilities, where the dead would be efficiently documented before mass burial. The soldiers of Krieg adapted to the harsh Vraksian environment with the stoicism for which they were renowned. The planet's toxic atmosphere, polluted by centuries of industrial activity and weapons testing, posed no challenge to troops who had grown up in the nuclear wasteland of their homeworld. Their standard-issue respirators filtered the worst contaminants, while their greatcoats provided protection against the caustic precipitation that frequently fell from Vraks' cloud-choked skies. By the end of the first month, the 3 landing zones had been secured against enemy counterattack. Defensive perimeters extended approximately 12 kilometers from each landing site, creating secure areas where subsequent waves of troops and equipment could arrive safely. Artillery batteries established interlocking fields of fire, while reconnaissance units probed the enemy defenses to identify weaknesses that could be exploited in the coming advance. Lord Commander Xaphan established his forward headquarters at Landing Zone Solaris, converting a captured munitions bunker into a command center from which he could coordinate the 3-pronged assault. Communication networks linked the scattered Imperial forces, allowing for coordinated artillery barrages and preventing the enemy from concentrating their forces against any single landing zone. Daily tactical briefings established the methodical pace that would characterize the entire campaign, advances measured in meters, objectives defined by specific bunker complexes or artillery positions rather than grand geographical features. The first significant test of the Imperial foothold came approximately 6 weeks after the initial landings. Cardinal Xaphan, recognizing the threat the established beachheads represented, launched coordinated counterattacks against all 3 landing zones. Masses of fanatical disciples, supported by captured Leman Rust tanks and artillery, surged toward the Imperial positions in human wave assaults reminiscent of the most desperate battles of the Horus Heresy. The Death Korps received these attacks with characteristic discipline. Defensive positions had been prepared with interlocking fields of fire, pre-registered artillery targeting, and carefully planned killing zones. As the disciples charged across open ground, they were met with devastating volleys of las-gun fire, the mechanical thump of heavy bolters, and precisely timed artillery barrages. Those few who reached the Imperial trenches found the Death Korps equally adept at close-quarter fighting, their trench knives and shotguns wielded with grim efficiency. The failed counterattacks confirmed what Lord Commander Xaphan had already suspected. While numerous and fanatical, Xaphan's forces lacked the training and discipline to dislodge the Death Korps from prepared positions. This validation of Imperial tactical superiority allowed Xaphan to proceed with the next phase of his plan, the establishment of a continuous siege line connecting the 3 landing zones into a single containment perimeter around the fortress world. By the close of the 813th year of the 41st millennium, the first phase of the 88th Siege Army's deployment was complete. A continuous front of trenches, bunkers, and artillery positions encircled Vraks' outer defensive ring. Supply lines had been secured, command structures established, and the methodical advance toward the first major objective, the breaching of defensive line primus, could begin. The Death Korps of Krieg had established their stranglehold on the Apostate Cardinal's fortress. Now began the slow, bloody process of tightening that grip until Vraks returned to Imperial control. As the Death Korps established their initial footholds around Vraks Prime, the true nature of their methodical war doctrine began to manifest across the blasted landscape. The transition from securing landing zones to constructing proper siege infrastructure was seamless. For the soldiers of Krieg, one phase of warfare flowed naturally into the next, each step executed with the precision of centuries-old tactical doctrine. The construction of the siege lines began with meticulous surveying operations. Krieg Engineer Corps units, identifiable by their distinctive black shoulder boards, deployed specialized auspex equipment to map the terrain between Imperial positions and the first defensive ring. These surveys accounted for elevation changes, soil composition, underground structures, and fields of fire from enemy emplacements. The resulting tactical maps guided the placement of every trench, bunker, and artillery position in the developing siege network. The standard Krieg trench system followed a pattern refined through thousands of sieges across the galaxy. Forward trenches, known as assault positions, were constructed approximately 800 meters from enemy fortifications, just beyond the effective range of most defensive small arms, but close enough for Imperial artillery observers to direct accurate fire. These forward positions featured reinforced firing steps, sniper platforms, and hardened Vox relay stations to coordinate attacks. Behind these, at intervals of roughly 200 meters, stretched the support and reserve trenches. These deeper excavations housed command posts, medical stations, and ammunition caches. Connecting these parallel lines were communication trenches, dug in zigzag patterns to minimize the impact of enemy artillery and prevent a single breach from compromising the entire network. The resulting grid resembled a vast web spreading across the Vraksian wasteland, each strand positioned to channel men and materials toward the enemy while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. The 291st Engineer Regiment specialized in what Krieg doctrine termed circumvallation, the construction of fortifications facing the enemy, and contravallation, defenses facing outward to protect against relief forces. Their work transformed the initial perimeter into a formidable barrier that simultaneously pressed inward toward the renegade Cardinal's positions while securing the Imperial rear against potential outside interference. Given the strategic importance of Vraks and its substantial munition stockpiles, Lord Commander Xaphan considered the possibility of chaos reinforcements a genuine threat that required concrete defensive measures. Specialized mining companies from the Engineer Corps established tunnel networks beneath the advancing trench lines. These tunnels served multiple purposes within Krieg siege doctrine. Some extended toward enemy positions, allowing for surprise attacks from below or the placement of explosive charges beneath fortifications. Others connected different sectors of the Imperial line, permitting the rapid and concealed movement of reinforcements to threatened areas. The most extensive tunnels housed subterranean command centers, protected from enemy artillery by dozens of meters of soil and rockcrete reinforcement. The Death Korps' approach to tunnel warfare reflected their homeworld's environment, where much of the population had been driven underground by nuclear devastation. Each tunnel was constructed to exacting specifications, 1.8 meters in height, 1.2 meters in width, with support struts placed every 1.5 meters. Ventilation shafts were disguised within shell craters or collapsed buildings, while water pumps worked continuously to prevent flooding in lower sections. Specialized teams of listeners maintained constant vigilance for the sounds of enemy counter-mining, using amplification devices to detect tunneling activity dozens of meters away through solid earth. As the siege lines expanded, the Krieg artillery regiments established their firing positions according to a carefully calibrated pattern. Heavy batteries of Earthshaker cannons occupied the rearmost positions, capable of bombarding targets up to 15 kilometers distant. Closer to the front, Medusa siege guns and bombard mortars provided more direct fire support for infantry assaults. These artillery parks were concealed beneath camouflage netting and surrounded by defensive earthworks to protect against enemy counter-battery fire. The systematic deployment of artillery followed the Krieg principle of suppression through saturation. Rather than targeting specific enemy emplacements with precision fire, Death Korps doctrine favored prolonged bombardment of entire sectors to gradually degrade all defensive capabilities simultaneously. This approach consumed enormous quantities of ammunition, but aligned with the Death Korps' willingness to expend resources liberally to achieve objectives. The constant thunder of Imperial guns became the background noise of life on Vraks, a relentless percussion that continued day and night without interruption. Ammunition supply for this prodigious expenditure of shells required a logistical operation of staggering proportions. The Quartermaster Corps established forward supply dumps at 5-kilometer intervals behind the front lines, each capable of storing shells sufficient for 3 days of continuous bombardment. Munitions arrived from orbit via armored landing craft, were processed through central depots, and then distributed to forward positions by endless convoys of Trojan support vehicles and Centaur light carriers. The roads connecting these supply points became deeply rutted tracks from the constant traffic, requiring dedicated engineering teams to maintain their usability in Vraks' frequently inclement weather. The Death Korps' approach to sector responsibility divided the encirclement into 17 distinct operational zones, each assigned to specific regiments with clearly delineated boundaries. This compartmentalization ensured that local reverses could be contained without compromising the broader advance. Each sector command maintained independent supply lines, artillery support, and reserve forces, allowing them to operate autonomously if communications were disrupted. This decentralized command structure proved particularly valuable given the electromagnetic interference generated by Vraks void shield arrays, which frequently disrupted Vox communications across the front. Facing these methodically advancing siege works stood the formidable defensive rings of Vraks Prime. The outermost ring, designated defense line Primus by Imperial tacticians, consisted of hardened bunker complexes spaced at 500-meter intervals around the planet's primary strategic facilities. Each bunker housed heavy weapons teams with overlapping fields of fire, while pre-sighted artillery positions could saturate the approaches with high explosive and fragmentation shells. Between these strong points stretched tangles of razor wire, minefields, and anti-tank ditches, passive defenses designed to channel attacking forces into carefully prepared killing zones. Behind this outer ring lay two additional defensive lines of increasing strength. Defense Line Secundus featured more substantial fortifications, including reinforced ferrocrete bunkers capable of withstanding direct hits from basilisk shells. Many incorporated captured void shield generators to protect critical strong points, requiring Imperial forces to overwhelm the shields through sustained fire before effective damage could be inflicted on the structures themselves. The innermost defensive ring, Defense Line Tertius, represented the final conventional barrier before the citadel itself. This line integrated natural terrain features with artificial fortifications to create an almost impenetrable barrier. Mountainous ridges had been hollowed out to house massive artillery pieces, while valleys were filled with interlocking defensive positions that eliminated any possibility of finding a weak point. Attempting to breach this line through frontal assault would result in casualties even the Death Korps might find prohibitive. At the center of these concentric rings stood the Vraks Citadel, the ultimate objective of the Imperial campaign. This massive structure, originally designed as the administrative heart of the Adeptus Munitorum's operations on the planet, had been transformed by Cardinal Xaphan into a virtually impregnable fortress. Its outer walls rose 30 meters above the surrounding terrain, constructed from adamantium-reinforced ferrocrete capable of withstanding bombardment from all but the most powerful siege weapons. Most formidable among the Citadel's defenses was the void shield array protecting the Cardinal's palace at its center. This system, incorporating technology far beyond the standard patterns used elsewhere on Vraks, generated overlapping fields capable of absorbing tremendous energy before overloading. Intelligence gathered by Krieg reconnaissance units suggested the shields could withstand sustained bombardment from an entire artillery regiment for several hours before showing signs of instability. Breaching these defenses would require either overwhelming firepower concentrated at a single point or the infiltration of strike teams to disable the generators from within. The Death Korps advanced toward these formidable defenses, proceeded with methodical precision. Each forward movement began with extensive preparation, softening bombardments lasting days or even weeks, followed by probing attacks to identify weaknesses. When a suitable point was identified, engineer teams would extend the trench network forward under cover of darkness and smoke screens. These new positions would be rapidly reinforced and connected to the existing network, creating a new forward line from which the next advance could be launched. This pattern of bite and hold tactics characterized the entire Imperial approach to the siege. Rather than attempting dramatic breakthroughs, the Death Korps secured small sections of ground in succession, gradually constricting the defensive perimeter like a slowly tightening noose. Progress was measured not in kilometers, but in meters gained, each small advance purchased with blood but never relinquished once taken. The siege regiment's sectors of responsibility were assigned based on the specific challenges presented by different portions of the defensive ring. The 143rd and 149th regiments, with their higher proportion of armored support, were tasked with advancing across the relatively open ground of the southern approach. The 158th and 163rd, with their specialized assault engineers, focused on the heavily fortified northern sector where bunker complexes were most concentrated. The 201st and 261st, arriving in the second wave of deployments, secured the eastern approach where the terrain's natural ridgelines offered some cover for advancing forces. Coordination between these sectors relied on the Death Korps' highly standardized communication protocols. Daily situation reports followed a uniform format that allowed command staff to quickly assess progress across the entire front. Artillery fire plans were synchronized through dedicated Vox channels, ensuring that bombardments in one sector would not interfere with planned infantry movements in adjacent areas. This rigid adherence to established procedures compensated for the limited initiative typically displayed by Krieg officers, creating an effective, if somewhat inflexible, operational system. The human cost of this methodical advance was enormous, even by the grim standards of Imperial warfare. Daily casualty reports from the frontline regiments regularly exceeded several hundred dead and wounded, losses that would have shattered the morale of conventional guard units. To the Death Korps, however, such casualties represented not disaster but expected attrition, the necessary price of progress in siege warfare. Replacement troops arrived in a constant stream from Krieg, each new soldier stepping into the place of the fallen with neither ceremony nor hesitation. Medical facilities established behind the lines reflected the Death Korps' utilitarian approach to casualties. Field hospitals focused primarily on treating those who could be returned to duty within a reasonable timeframe. Those with more severe injuries were evacuated to orbital Medici ships for intensive treatment, while the dead were processed through efficient mortuary stations, where their equipment was salvaged for reuse before the bodies were consigned to mass graves. The regiment's gene seed, the genetic material that would be used to create the next generation of Krieg soldiers, was carefully collected and preserved, maintaining the cycle of service that had defined the planet for millennia. The psychological impact of this grinding warfare on the participants manifested in different ways. For the Death Korps, raised from birth to embrace sacrifice and inured to suffering through harsh training, the horrors of the siege merely confirmed their worldview. Each soldier viewed their potential death as merely the fulfillment of their purpose, repayment of the debt incurred by their ancestors' rebellion against the Emperor. This fatalistic acceptance allowed them to endure conditions that would have broken conventional troops. For Cardinal Xaphan's forces, the psychological effects proved more complex. The initial waves of fanatics hurled against Imperial positions were driven by religious fervor, believing the Cardinal's promises that their sacrifice would earn divine favor. As the siege lines tightened and the methodical nature of the Death Korps' advance became apparent, this fervor began to give way to a grim realization of the fate awaiting them. Desertion attempts increased among the less indoctrinated elements, while the core of true believers retreated further into apocalyptic visions of ultimate vindication. As the first year of the siege drew to a close, the Death Korps had established siege lines extending completely around Vraks' defensive perimeter. The infrastructure supporting this massive operation had grown to include dozens of landing fields for supply shuttles, extensive medical facilities, repair depots for the constant maintenance of vehicles and artillery pieces, and the vast logistical network necessary to sustain hundreds of thousands of troops in the field. What had begun as 3 isolated landing zones had transformed into a fully developed siege operation, with all the machinery of Imperial war grinding inexorably toward the distant walls of the Citadel. By the beginning of the second year of the siege, the true horror of Vraks was revealing itself in ways that even the grim Death Korps commanders found noteworthy. The artillery barrages had reached a scale unprecedented in recent Imperial history. Each day, thousands of Earthshaker rounds, Medusa shells, and bombard mortars rained down upon the defensive lines of Cardinal Xaphan's forces, churning the already toxic soil into a poisonous quagmire that resembled the worst hellscapes of ancient Terra's most devastating wars. The 88th Siege Army's artillery regiments operated on rotating fire missions, ensuring that no sector of the enemy line ever enjoyed respite from bombardment. The 261st Artillery Regiment alone expended an average of 15,000 shells daily across their assigned sector, their gun barrels requiring replacement every 3 days due to the constant firing. Behind the artillery positions stretched vast ammunition dumps where servitors and labor details worked ceaselessly to unpack, sort, and distribute the endless stream of ordnance arriving from orbit. This constant barrage transformed the landscape into an unrecognizable wasteland. What had once been defensive earthworks became cratered moonscapes where nothing could survive unprotected. The few structures that remained standing were reduced to skeletal frameworks of twisted metal and crumbling ferrocrete. Even the air itself became a weapon, filled with toxic particulates from explosives and disturbed industrial waste that could corrode unprotected flesh within hours of exposure. Against this apocalyptic backdrop, the Death Korps launched their assaults on the outer defensive ring. Each attack followed a precisely calculated pattern that prioritized territorial gain over preservation of life. Reconnaissance units would identify a target, typically a bunker complex or artillery position, and mark it for concentrated bombardment. After days of sustained shelling, assault teams would advance across the devastated ground, moving from shell hole to shell hole under covering fire from heavy weapons teams. The casualty rates during these advances defied comprehension by conventional military standards. The 158th Siege Regiment's attack on Redoubt 47, a key strongpoint in the northern sector, saw 37% of the assault force killed or wounded before they even reached the enemy positions. Of those who made it to the defensive perimeter, nearly half fell to automated defense systems and prepared killing zones. Yet the survivors pressed on, using flamers and demolition charges to clear the bunker complexes room by room in vicious close quarters fighting that left no survivors on either side. Such losses would have broken most Imperial Guard regiments, but to the Death Korps, they represented merely the expected cost of progress. The 158th after-action report noted the casualties in the same detached tone used to document ammunition expenditure or ground gained. By Krieg standards, the operation was deemed a success, the objective had been taken, and the casualties had fallen within acceptable parameters for an assault against a hardened position. This clinical approach to human life extended throughout the Death Korps command structure. When the 143rd Siege Regiment became bogged down in their advance toward Artillery Battery Sigma 119, Lord Commander Zwakel did not hesitate to order a frontal assault across open ground swept by enemy fire. The subsequent attack cost the lives of 4,000 Krieg guardsmen, but succeeded in neutralizing the battery, allowing adjacent units to advance. In his daily briefing, Zwakel noted only that the operation had proceeded according to established tactical doctrine, and that replacement troops were already en route to restore the 143rd to fighting strength. The scale of casualties throughout the siege reached levels that required specialized infrastructure to manage. Behind the front lines, vast processing centers handled the endless stream of dead and wounded with mechanical efficiency. Triage stations sorted the injured based on their prospects for recovery and return to combat. Those deemed likely to recover quickly received priority treatment, while more severely wounded were often relegated to palliative care until transport to orbital medical facilities became available. For the dead, the process was even more streamlined. Corpse collection teams moved through the trenches after each assault, gathering the fallen and transporting them to mortuary stations where their equipment was salvaged, identification recorded, and bodies interred in mass graves excavated by engineering units. The personal effects of the deceased were not returned to families. By Krieg tradition, a soldier's family was informed of their death when they departed for war, making subsequent notification unnecessary. Instead, usable items were redistributed to replacement troops, maintaining the cycle of service that defined Death Korps' existence. The replacement system itself represented a logistical operation of staggering proportions. Each week, transport ships arrived in orbit carrying thousands of new Krieg guardsmen to replace the fallen. These soldiers, products of Krieg's vidi-womb technology rather than conventional reproduction, arrived already fully trained in the regiment's tactical doctrine and indoctrinated in its fatalistic philosophy. They were assigned to units based on casualty reports, filling gaps in the line with the same interchangeability as ammunition being loaded into a magazine. This constant flow of replacements maintained the Death Korps at near nominal strength despite catastrophic losses. The 149th Siege Regiment, which had landed with 12,000 men at the start of the campaign, had suffered over 28,000 casualties by the end of the second year, a figure that exceeded their original strength by more than double. Yet through the replacement system, they remained combat effective, their institutional knowledge preserved through surviving veterans and the standardized training of newcomers. As the siege lines tightened around the outer defensive ring, both sides increasingly turned to chemical warfare to break the stalemate. The Death Korps, with their universal respirator equipment, held a significant advantage in this domain. Krieg chemical troops deployed a variety of toxins developed specifically for siege operations, from paralytic agents that immobilized defenders long enough for assault teams to breach their positions, to corrosive compounds that degraded structural integrity of fortifications over time. The 291st Chemical Warfare Company specialized in deploying these agents through a combination of artillery shells, aerosol dispensers, and contamination of water sources. Their most effective deployment came during the assault on Sector 17A, where a cocktail of neurotoxins and hallucinogens was introduced into the ventilation system of a major bunker complex. When Krieg assault teams breached the outer defenses, they found most of the defenders already incapacitated or engaged in fratricidal combat induced by the psychoactive compounds. Cardinal Xaphan's forces responded with chemical attacks of their own, though with less sophisticated delivery systems. Crude chlorine and phosphex bombs launched against Krieg positions caused significant damage to equipment and contaminated water supplies, but the Death Korps standard issue respirators and chemical-resistant garments limited casualties. More insidious were the warp-tainted toxins developed in the Citadel's biological laboratories, compounds that corroded both flesh and soul, leaving victims with mutations that necessitated immediate execution under Krieg protocols. The no-man's land between opposing trench systems became a toxic wasteland where even the hardy native vegetation of Vraks withered and died. Pools of chemical residue collected in shell craters, giving off vapors that could kill an unprotected human within minutes. The soil itself became saturated with poisons, heavy metals, and more esoteric contaminants, creating an environment hostile to all forms of life. Krieg pioneers tasked with clearing paths for advancing troops reported chemical concentrations that exceeded even the most polluted regions of their homeworld. This poisoned landscape necessitated increasingly specialized equipment for both attackers and defenders. The Death Korps augmented their standard respirators with additional filtration systems and sealed their uniforms with chemical-resistant compounds. Vehicle crews operated in completely enclosed environments, with Leman Russ tanks modified to include advanced life support systems that could function independently for up to 72 hours in contaminated zones. Even artillery observers required specialized equipment, as conventional magnoculars could be corroded by the caustic atmosphere. Despite these precautions, chemical casualties mounted on both sides. Medical facilities reported increasing numbers of troops suffering from toxic exposure, respiratory damage, skin necrosis, neurological impairment, and more exotic conditions that defied conventional treatment. The Death Korps' approach to such casualties was characteristically pragmatic. Those who could be treated quickly returned to duty, while those with permanent impairment were reassigned to less demanding roles, or, in severe cases, granted the Emperor's peace through euthanasia. As the siege ground into its third year, the psychological effects of the constant artillery bombardment began to manifest among the defenders. Intercepted Vox transmissions revealed increasing instances of mental breakdown among Cardinal Xaphan's troops, particularly those manning the forward positions under constant shelling. The human mind, even one fortified by fanatical devotion or chemical stimulants, could only endure so much before fracturing under the strain of never-ending bombardment. Krieg intelligence officers noted with clinical interest the changing patterns in enemy behavior. Initial defensive positions had been characterized by disciplined resistance and coordinated counterattacks. As the bombardment continued without respite, this gave way to more erratic responses, suicidal charges across open ground, abandonment of tactically important positions, or paralyzed inaction even when opportunities presented themselves. These behavioral changes confirmed the effectiveness of the Death Korps doctrine of psychological attrition through sustained artillery fire. For Xaphan's forces, the psychological pressure was compounded by increasing isolation. As the Imperial siege lines tightened, communication between defensive sectors became more difficult, creating a sense of abandonment among forward units. The Cardinal's propaganda broadcasts continued to promise imminent victory and divine intervention, but for troops huddled in crumbling bunkers under constant bombardment, such assurances rang increasingly hollow against the daily reality of their situation. Most concerning for the defenders was the growing evidence of chaos corruption spreading through their ranks. What had begun as isolated incidents, strange mutations, unexplained phenomena, whispered conversations with unseen entities, gradually became more widespread as the siege progressed. Troops stationed near the Citadel, where Cardinal Xaphan's rituals grew increasingly elaborate and desperate, reported disturbing changes in their comrades. Physical mutations, violent mood swings, and in some cases, possession by entities that defied rational explanation. Death Korps reconnaissance units began to report encounters with defenders who no longer appeared fully human. Augmented by warp energies, these corrupted soldiers displayed unnatural resilience and strength, continuing to fight even after sustaining wounds that should have been immediately fatal. More disturbing were the changes in their tactics, from the disciplined defense of strategic positions to savage, almost bestial assaults that prioritized inflicting pain over achieving military objectives. The 158th Siege Regiment's encounter with such forces during the assault on Redoubt 34 resulted in the implementation of new tactical protocols. After conventional weapons proved insufficient against defenders who continued fighting despite catastrophic injuries, Flamer teams were integrated into all assault squads with orders to purge any position showing signs of warp corruption. The regiment's commissars received additional authority to execute any troops who displayed unusual symptoms after contact with corrupted enemy forces, a precaution against potential contamination spreading through Imperial lines. This corruption manifested most visibly in the changing appearance of the defensive positions themselves. Bunkers that had once displayed the ordered geometry of Imperial construction began to develop unsettling asymmetries. Metal surfaces developed organic-seeming textures, while concrete walls exuded fluid that resembled blood in consistency but defied chemical analysis. Captured positions had to be thoroughly purged with flame and explosives before Imperial forces could occupy them, and even then, troops stationed in such locations reported disturbing dreams and unexplained equipment malfunctions. The Death Korps' response to these developments was characteristically methodical. Special protocols were established for dealing with corrupted positions, including mandatory flame purging of all captured bunkers and the establishment of quarantine zones around areas showing signs of warp influence. Commissariat officials attached to each regiment received enhanced authority to monitor for signs of contamination among Imperial troops, with standing orders to execute any soldier displaying suspicious symptoms or behavior. Despite these precautions, the constant exposure to warp-tainted environments began to take a toll even on the stoic Death Korps. Regimental medici reported increasing instances of unexplained ailments, nightmares that persisted into waking hours, phantom pain in uninjured limbs, and in some cases, auditory hallucinations described as whispers from the shells. These symptoms were carefully documented and reported to the commissariat, resulting in a significant increase in summary executions for suspected warp contamination. The grinding nature of the siege took on new dimensions as the Death Korps penetrated deeper into the defensive rings. Each position captured revealed new horrors, evidence of ritual sacrifices in command bunkers, walls inscribed with symbols that hurt the eyes to observe, and in some cases, the remains of defenders who appeared to have been consumed by their own mutations. Engineering teams tasked with securing these positions frequently requested flame units to purge areas before standard fortification work could begin. By the fourth year of the siege, the outer defensive ring had been largely breached, though at a cost that would have been deemed unacceptable in any other Imperial campaign. The Death Korps had suffered casualties exceeding 60% of their original strength, with some front-line companies having been completely replaced multiple times over. Yet the advance continued with the same methodical precision, each meter of ground taken becoming another step in the inexorable progress toward the central citadel, where Cardinal Xaphan directed his increasingly desperate defense. The psychological impact of the siege on the defenders manifested in increasingly erratic behavior. Intercepted Vox transmissions revealed growing dissension within Xaphan's forces, with some commanders questioning the Cardinal's strategies or even his sanity. These doubts were met with brutal purges, further depleting the already strained defensive forces. Desertion attempts increased, though few succeeded. Those caught by their own side faced ritualistic execution, while those who reached Imperial lines typically carried such obvious signs of corruption that Death Korps forces eliminated them on sight. As the Imperial forces prepared to assault the second defensive ring, Lord Commander Xaphan's staff compiled casualty figures that illustrated the true cost of the campaign. In 4 years of fighting, the 88th Siege Army had suffered over 1.2 million casualties, dead, wounded, and those executed for suspected contamination. Yet by Death Korps standards, this represented an acceptable exchange rate for the ground gained and the damage inflicted on the enemy. The siege would continue, regardless of cost, until Cardinal Xaphan's heresy was answered with the Emperor's justice, delivered through the unyielding resolve of Krieg's sons and daughters. As the Siege of Vraks ground into its 5th year, the true nature of Cardinal Xaphan's rebellion began to manifest in ways that even the most hardened Death Korps veterans found disturbing. The first confirmed sighting of Chaos Space Marines came during an assault on Redoubt 73 in the middle defensive ring. A squad from the 143rd Siege Regiment had breached the outer walls of the fortification when they encountered warriors in power armor bearing the distinctive Hydra insignia of the Alpha Legion. The engagement was brief and devastating. Of the 20 Krieg guardsmen who entered the redoubt, only one returned alive to report what he had witnessed. Initial reports were met with skepticism by Lord Commander Xaphan's staff. The possibility that Cardinal Xaphan had secured the support of traitor Astartes represented a significant escalation beyond what Imperial intelligence had anticipated. Confirmation came 3 days later when long-range picked captures from a reconnaissance Valkyrie clearly showed Alpha Legion warriors directing defensive operations at multiple strongpoints along the secondary defensive line. The images revealed not just their distinctive azure armor with silver-green highlights, but also their characteristic use of infiltration tactics, with several legionaries observed wearing modified versions of Vraksian militia uniforms to move undetected among the Cardinal's forces. The Alpha Legion's presence explained the sudden improvement in defensive coordination that Imperial forces had encountered in recent months. Where previously the Vraksian defense had been characterized by fanatical but tactically unsophisticated resistance, they now faced carefully planned ambushes, counter-attacks timed to exploit vulnerabilities in the Imperial advance, and defensive positions that seemed to anticipate the Death Korps' siege tactics with uncanny precision. Interrogation of captured Vraksian officers revealed that Alpha Legion advisors had been present since at least the 3rd year of the siege, though initially in small numbers and operating covertly. Their influence had gradually expanded as Cardinal Xaphan's position deteriorated, offering tactical expertise in exchange for access to the planet's munitions stockpiles, and more disturbingly, to the Cardinal's growing pool of potential recruits for the traitor legions. The Alpha Legion was not alone in their interest in Vraks. Within weeks of their confirmed presence, Imperial forces began to encounter warriors bearing the iconography of the Word-bearers, their crimson armor adorned with profane texts and unholy symbols. Unlike the Alpha Legion's subtle approach, the Word-bearers made no attempt to conceal their presence. They led from the front in counterattacks, their bolters cutting down Krieg guardsmen with contemptuous ease, while they chanted blasphemous litanies that caused nearby electronics to malfunction and unprotected flesh to blister. The word-bearers brought with them a new dimension to the conflict, spiritual corruption, on a scale that threatened the Death Korps' iron discipline. Their dark apostles established shrines in captured bunkers and redoubts, conducting rituals that thinned the barrier between real space and the warp. The effects manifested in disturbing phenomena across the battlefield: spontaneous combustion of munitions, Vox units broadcasting screams in unknown languages, and most alarmingly, reports of the dead rising to attack their former comrades in isolated outposts. Death Korps commissars responded with increased vigilance, executing any soldier who showed signs of psychological distress or reported unusual experiences. These summary executions reached such levels that Lord Commander Xaphan was forced to issue a directive reminding the commissariat that maintaining combat strength required some discretion in their duties. The directive was largely ignored. To the grim-faced political officers, preserving the spiritual purity of the regiments took precedence over tactical considerations. By the 6th year of the siege, the presence of traitor Astartes had expanded to include elements of the Iron Warriors Legion. Their arrival marked a significant shift in the defensive strategy employed by Xaphan's forces. Under the direction of Iron Warriors Warsmith Kalvax, the middle defensive ring was rapidly reinforced with sophisticated fortifications that bore the unmistakable hallmarks of Perturabo's sons: interlocking fields of fire, cunningly concealed bunkers, and defensive positions designed to funnel attackers into pre-sighted killing zones. The Iron Warriors brought with them massive siege engines of ancient design, including several Typhon heavy siege tanks whose massive Dreadhammer cannons could reduce even the most heavily reinforced Death Korps positions to rubble with a single shell. These war machines were deployed at strategic points along the defensive line, their mere presence forcing Imperial commanders to divert significant resources to neutralize them before advances could continue. The Death Korps' response to these developments was characteristically stoic. Tactical doctrines were adjusted to account for the presence of traitor Astartes, with special emphasis on avoiding direct engagements where possible. Heavy weapons teams were instructed to prioritize targeting of identified Chaos Space Marines, while assault units received additional training in using their numbers to overwhelm the physically superior but numerically limited traitors. Despite these adaptations, the casualty rate among Imperial forces increased dramatically wherever traitor Astartes were encountered. A single Chaos Space Marine could cut through a squad of guardsmen in seconds, their enhanced physiology and warp-tainted armor rendering them virtually invulnerable to standard-issue lasguns. Even concentrated heavy weapons fire often proved insufficient, with reports of traitors continuing to fight despite injuries that would have incapacitated even loyal Space Marines. The most disturbing development came in the 7th year of the siege, when Imperial intelligence confirmed that the traitor Astartes were not merely supporting Cardinal Xaphan's rebellion, but actively recruiting from his forces. The most fanatical and physically capable of the Cardinal's disciples were being subjected to corrupted versions of Space Marine implantation procedures, creating new generations of Chaos Space Marines to replace the Legion's losses. These new recruits, though less formidable than the original traitor Marines who had fought in the Horus Heresy, still represented a significant threat to Imperial forces. Their partial transformation left them in a state of constant agony that fueled their hatred of the Imperium, while the accelerated and flawed implantation process often resulted in unpredictable mutations that could provide unexpected combat advantages. Death Korps units began to encounter these new-made traitors with increasing frequency, identifying them by their ill-fitting armor cobbled together from scavenged pieces and their frenzied, often suicidal attack patterns. Alongside the growing traitor Astartes' presence, Cardinal Xaphan's forces underwent a more profound transformation. What had begun as a rebellion led by a corrupted ecclesiarchy official had evolved into a full-fledged chaos cult with all the horrors that entailed. The Cardinal's inner circle, once composed of ambitious clerics and disaffected Adeptus Munitorum officials, now included individuals known as the Tainted, mortal servants who had received blessings from the chaos gods that manifested as disturbing physical and psychological changes. These tainted leaders directed the spiritual corruption of the Vraksian defense forces, transforming what had been the disciples of Xaphan into the Vraksian traitor militia. This transformation was more than nominal. It represented a fundamental shift in the nature of the enemy the Death Korps faced. Where once they had fought misguided but essentially human opponents, they now confronted adversaries who had willingly embraced corruption, many of whom had sacrificed their humanity for the promise of power. The Vraksian traitor militia received more than spiritual guidance from their new overlords. The traitor Astartes, particularly the Iron Warriors, provided them with advanced weaponry and equipment drawn from hidden caches dating back to the Horus Heresy. Lasguns were replaced with more potent weapons, including plasma guns and melta weapons that could threaten even armored Imperial vehicles. Some units received specialized close combat weapons, chain axes, power mauls, and warp-enhanced blades that could slice through flak armor as easily as cloth. Most alarming was the distribution of warp-tainted ammunition among the traitor forces. Death Korps medici reported wounds that refused to heal, spreading corruption through the victim's body, until amputation or euthanasia became the only options. Even glancing hits from these corrupted rounds could result in systemic infection that transformed dying soldiers into incubators for demonic entities that would burst forth at the moment of death to attack nearby troops. The transformation of the Vraksian forces extended to their command structure. Alongside the Tainted emerged the demagogues, charismatic leaders whose oratory skills, enhanced by warp energies, could inspire fanatical loyalty in their followers. These individuals led from the front in attacks against Imperial positions, their presence driving the traitor militia to feats of courage or atrocity that would have been impossible through conventional leadership. Death Korps intelligence identified several dozen such individuals operating across the defensive lines, each developing their own cult of personality among the troops under their command. Perhaps most dangerous were the rogue psychers who began to manifest among the defenders. Whether they had always possessed latent abilities that were awakened by exposure to warp energies, or were ordinary humans transformed by chaos influence, remained unclear. What was certain was their devastating effect on the battlefield. Untrained and often unstable, these psychers represented as much danger to their allies as to Imperial forces, but their raw power made them valuable assets to the traitor command. The Death Korps encountered these psychers with increasing frequency as they pushed deeper into the defensive rings. A single such individual could decimate an advancing company with torrents of warp fire or psychic assaults that caused troops to experience their worst fears made manifest. Commissars issued standing orders to prioritize the elimination of identified psychers, authorizing the expenditure of precious artillery shells or even rare sniper rounds to remove these threats before they could fully deploy their abilities. By the 8th year of the siege, the summoning of demonic entities had become commonplace within the inner defensive rings. What had begun as isolated incidents, reports of impossible creatures, or entities that defied description, evolved into a systematic practice directed by word-bearers' dark apostles. Ritual sites were established at strategic locations, where mass sacrifices of prisoners or even willing cultists tore holes in the fabric of reality to allow warp entities passage into real space. The first major demonic manifestation occurred during the Death Korps assault on Sector 46C. The 158th Siege Regiment had breached the outer defenses of a major strongpoint when the defenders withdrew in seemingly good order, abandoning a position they had previously defended with fanatical determination. As the Krieg forces advanced cautiously into the complex, reality itself seemed to distort around them. Survivors reported temperature drops that froze lubricants in their weapons, followed by the appearance of entities that resembled massive, hunched humanoids with elongated limbs and faceless heads. The regiment suffered 63% casualties before they could withdraw from the position, with many of the dead showing no physical injuries, but expressions of extreme terror frozen on their faces. Imperial response to these developments required specialized assets beyond the Death Korps' standard capabilities. Inquisitorial representatives attached to Lord Commander Xaphan's staff authorized the deployment of sanctioned psychers to detect and counter warp manifestations. These individuals, though viewed with suspicion by the Death Korps rank and file, proved invaluable in identifying areas where the barrier between real space and the warp had been weakened, allowing Imperial forces to avoid the most contaminated zones or prepare appropriate countermeasures before engagement. The transformation of the Vraksian forces extended to their equipment as well as their personnel. Vehicles captured from Imperial stockpiles or brought by the traitor Astartes underwent disturbing modifications under the direction of Dark Mechanicum adepts. Leman Rust tanks developed organic-seeming protrusions that oozed corrosive fluids. Sentinel walkers moved with unnaturally fluid motions, as though the machine spirits had been replaced by something more malevolent. Even basic equipment like Vox casters and Auspex units developed aberrant behaviors, sometimes broadcasting the screams of their previous operators or displaying readings that drove observers to madness. The presence of dark mechanicum elements among the defenders represented a significant escalation in the conflict. These renegade tech priests brought with them knowledge of forbidden technologies and the ability to create demon engines, hybrid constructs of machine and warp entity that combine the worst aspects of both. Death Korps armored units began to encounter these abominations with increasing frequency. Mauler fiends that could tear apart Leman Rust tanks with adamantium shredding claws, Forgifiends whose demon-possessed weapon systems could track targets with malevolent intelligence, and Helldrakes that soared above the battlefield on mechanical wings, their breath weapons reducing infantry formations to ash and molten armor. By the 9th year of the siege, what had begun as a relatively straightforward operation to reclaim a rebellious Imperial world had transformed into something far more sinister, a full-scale chaos incursion that threatened not just Vraks, but potentially the entire sector. Lord Commander Xaphan's reports to Sector Command no longer focused on reclaiming munition stockpiles or executing a heretical cardinal. They emphasized the need to contain and eliminate a significant chaos presence before it could spread beyond the planet's surface. The Death Korps, for all their stoicism and determination, found themselves engaged in a conflict that tested the limits of their doctrine and training. Bred and conditioned for siege warfare against conventional enemies, they now faced adversaries that defied rational understanding and tactical prediction. Yet they adapted with the same grim determination that characterized all their operations, developing new protocols for engaging warp-tainted forces and adjusting their equipment to better counter the threats they faced. As the siege entered its 10th year, with Imperial forces finally breaching the middle defensive ring at several points, the true extent of Cardinal Xaphan's corruption became apparent to even the most skeptical observers. What had begun as one man's ambition and heresy had opened the door to something far worse, a foothold for the ruinous powers in a strategically vital Imperial world. The Death Korps of Krieg would continue their advance, yard by bloody yard, but the nature of the war had changed irrevocably. This was no longer merely a siege. It was a desperate struggle to contain an infection that, if left unchecked, could consume not just Vraks but countless worlds beyond. As the Death Korps tightened their stranglehold on Vraks Prime, Lord Commander Xaphan ordered the deployment of specialized units designed for the next phase of the grinding siege. The 19th Death Rider Squadron arrived in the 10th year, their distinctive steeds pawing at the toxic soil as they disembarked from armored landers. These were not ordinary cavalry, but the elite shock troops of Krieg, mounted on augmented horses bred for the most hostile environments imaginable. Each beast stood taller than a standard warhorse, with reinforced skeletal structures and enhanced respiratory systems that allowed them to function in Vraks' increasingly poisonous atmosphere. The Death Riders themselves cut imposing figures as they assembled at Forward Command Base Delta 9, clad in the distinctive greatcoats of Krieg, but modified with additional armor plating at vital points. They carried hunting lances tipped with explosive charges, designed to breach bunker firing slits or disable light vehicles. Their respirator masks incorporated enhanced targeting systems, while their mounts wore partial carapace armor that protected vital organs while maintaining mobility. Each squadron consisted of 20 riders organized into 4 sections, with a Death Rider commander at their head carrying the unit's standard, a tattered black flag bearing the skull symbol of Krieg embroidered in silver thread. Alongside the Death Riders came the elite Grenadier Storm Squads, veterans selected from the most experienced assault troops in each regiment. These soldiers wore carapace armor rather than the standard flak armor of line infantry, the overlapping plates capable of withstanding hits that would shred conventional protection. Their helmets featured enhanced auto senses and rebreather systems that could filter out even the most virulent toxins now present in Vraks' atmosphere. Each grenadier carried a Hellgun, a more powerful variant of the standard lasgun drawing power from backpack generators, and specialized grenades designed for bunker clearance. The deployment of these elite units signaled a shift in Imperial strategy. After years of methodical advances measured in meters, Xaphan planned to execute breakthrough operations at key points along the middle defensive ring. The Death Riders would exploit gaps created by artillery bombardment, pushing deep into enemy territory to disrupt communication and supply lines, while Grenadier Storm Squads would secure critical strongpoints to prevent enemy counterattacks from sealing the breaches. To support these operations, the mechanized elements of the siege army underwent significant reinforcement. Fresh companies of Leman Russ battle tanks arrived from Forge Worlds throughout the sector, their engines still bearing factory seals as they rolled down the ramps of massive landing craft. The standard battle tank variant formed the core of these armored formations, their turret-mounted battle cannons capable of reducing bunkers to rubble with concentrated fire. Supporting them were more specialized variants, demolishers with their short-barreled, high-caliber guns designed for close-range fortress breaking, exterminators whose rotary autocannons could saturate defensive positions with high-velocity shells, and punishers that could sweep trenches clear with their Gatling cannons. More impressive were the Malkador heavy tanks that arrived to reinforce the armored spearhead. These massive vehicles, significantly larger than the Leman Russ and mounting more substantial armament, represented an older pattern of Imperial armor rarely seen in such numbers. The standard Malkador variant carried a powerful battle cannon supported by multiple heavy bolters, while the Annihilator pattern replaced this with twin las cannons capable of piercing the heaviest enemy armor. Most feared by the defenders were the Malkador Infernus tanks, whose massive promethium projectors could flood defensive positions with burning fuel that clung to surfaces and continued burning even in Vraks' oxygen-poor atmosphere. The apex of Imperial armor capability arrived in the form of Baneblade squadrons. These super-heavy tanks, each weighing in excess of 300 tons, represented the ultimate expression of Imperial battlefield dominance. Their main armament, the massive Baneblade cannon, could demolish fortifications that had withstood weeks of conventional artillery fire, while their secondary weapon systems allowed them to engage multiple targets simultaneously. The psychological impact of these behemoths proved as valuable as their tactical capability. Intercepted Vox transmissions revealed that enemy forces would often abandon positions rather than face the approaching super heavies. The deployment of these armored formations required substantial logistical support. Trojan support vehicles followed behind the tank companies, carrying spare parts, ammunition, and fuel. Atlas recovery tanks stood ready to retrieve damaged vehicles from the battlefield, their powerful winches capable of towing even a disabled Baneblade to safety. Behind the lines, mobile repair stations operated day and night, their tech priests and servitor teams working tirelessly to return damaged vehicles to operational status. The concentrated armored thrust began at dawn on the 3,653rd day of the siege. After a preparatory bombardment that lasted 18 hours without pause, the tanks of Armored Battle Group Keld advanced through a gap in the defensive line designated Breach 7. The Leman Russ companies moved in arrowhead formations, with demolisher variants at the tip to absorb and return fire from remaining defensive positions. Behind them came the Malcadors, their heavier armament targeting identified strongpoints that could threaten the advance. The Baneblades followed in the wake of these formations, their massive guns silencing any significant resistance that the lighter tanks could not overcome. The breakthrough achieved what 3 years of infantry assaults had failed to accomplish. By nightfall, armored battle group Keld had penetrated 7 kilometers into enemy territory, creating a salient that threatened to split the defensive line in two. Death Rider squadrons exploited this success, moving through the gap under cover of darkness to strike at command bunkers and supply depots in the rear areas. Their attacks sowed confusion among the defenders, with contradictory orders and failed reinforcement attempts creating opportunities for further Imperial advances. Grenadier storm squads followed the armored spearhead, securing key terrain features and establishing defensive positions to protect the flanks of the salient. Their carapace armor proved its worth as they weathered desperate counter-attacks from Vraksian forces, including several led by traitor Astartes, who recognized the strategic threat the breakthrough represented. The 4th Grenadier Company of the 158th Siege Regiment earned particular distinction during this phase, holding an exposed position designated Hill 256 against 17 separate assaults over a 30-hour period, allowing the armored formations to continue their advance without concern for their southern flank. The success of the breakthrough operations led to a significant expansion of scorched earth tactics by both sides. The Vraksian defenders, recognizing they could not halt the Imperial advance, began systematically destroying anything of value in areas they could not hold. Munitions dumps were detonated, water purification systems poisoned, and infrastructure demolished to deny their use to Imperial forces. In some sectors, the defenders employed chemical weapons and radioactive materials to render entire areas uninhabitable, forcing the Death Korps to deploy in full NBC protection gear, even in rear areas. The Death Korps responded with their own program of environmental devastation. Recognizing that the defenders drew supplies and reinforcements from agricultural zones in the southern hemisphere, Zwakel authorized Operation Withered Field, a systematic campaign to destroy all food production capacity on the planet. Incendiary bombs dropped from Marauder bombers set vast croplands ablaze, while specially modified Hellhound tanks sprayed defoliant chemicals that rendered soil infertile for decades to come. Engineering Corps diverted rivers and destroyed irrigation systems, transforming once productive regions into barren wastelands within weeks. The environmental impact of these tactics was catastrophic and far-reaching. Vraks Prime had never been a garden world, but large portions of its surface had supported basic agriculture and maintained breathable atmosphere through extensive lichen forests that processed carbon dioxide. The combined effect of chemical warfare, unrestricted artillery bombardment, and deliberate environmental destruction transformed these areas into toxic wastelands where nothing could survive unprotected. Atmospheric contamination reached levels that required Imperial forces to operate in sealed environments throughout much of the planet. The Death Korps, already equipped with respirators as standard issue, adapted more readily than their enemies. Vraksian forces without access to similar protection suffered increasing casualties from respiratory diseases and chemical poisoning, further degrading their combat effectiveness as the siege progressed. The surface of Vraks underwent physical transformation as well. Concentrated artillery bombardment altered the very topography of the battlefield, with some areas receiving so many shells that the ground level was lowered by several meters. Hills that had appeared on pre-war maps ceased to exist, while new elevations formed from the accumulated debris of destroyed fortifications. Massive craters filled with toxic water created obstacle zones that channeled movement along predictable paths, which both sides exploited in their tactical planning. Strategic bombardment reached unprecedented levels during this phase of the siege. The Death Korps artillery regiments, already operating at an intensity that would have exhausted most Imperial Guard formations, increased their fire missions by 40% following the breakthrough. Basilisk self-propelled artillery platforms formed the backbone of these operations, their Earthshaker cannons capable of delivering 132-pound shells accurately at ranges up to 15 kilometers. These weapons operated in batteries of 4, with each battery assigned specific fire zones that they would saturate according to predetermined schedules. For closer fire support, Medusa siege guns proved devastatingly effective. These shorter-ranged but more powerful weapons fired shells nearly twice the weight of the Basilisk, designed specifically to demolish fortifications through sheer kinetic impact. Medusa batteries were positioned just behind the front lines, often operating within range of enemy counter-battery fire, but protected by earthworks and camouflage netting. Their distinctive dull boom echoed across the battlefield day and night, each shot capable of collapsing bunkers that had withstood weeks of lighter bombardment. The most devastating ground-based artillery came from the bombard heavy mortars. These massive weapons, with barrels angled at 45 degrees, launched shells weighing over 250 pounds in high arcing trajectories that dropped them almost vertically onto target areas. This approach proved particularly effective against the roofs of bunker complexes, which typically had less armor than their walls and firing ports. A direct hit from a bombard shell could penetrate up to 3 meters of reinforced ferrocrete, allowing following shells to detonate inside the structure with catastrophic effects for the defenders. Complementing these ground-based systems, the Imperial Navy contributed to the bombardment from orbit. Navy vessels maintained station above key target areas, their macro cannon batteries delivering payloads that dwarfed even the largest ground artillery. The battleship Eternal Vigilance, assigned specifically to support the Vraks operation, could deliver broadsides that leveled entire districts of the defensive complex, its massive guns creating overlapping blast zones where nothing could survive the initial impact, let alone the secondary explosions and collapsing structures that followed. For precision strikes against high-value targets, the Navy deployed Marauder destroyers operating from the carrier Emperor's Wrath. These aircraft, flying at altitudes beyond the reach of most ground-based defenses, carried guided bombs capable of penetrating the deepest bunkers before detonating. Their targeting systems, linked to forward observers on the ground, could place these munitions with accuracy measured in meters, sufficient to target specific entrances, power generators, or command centers within larger complexes. The combined effect of this bombardment transformed the battlefield in ways that even the most experienced Death Korps veterans found remarkable. Areas that had once contained elaborate defensive networks became cratered wastelands where even the rubble had been pulverized into fine dust. The constant vibration from artillery impacts caused progressive structural failure in underground facilities, with entire bunker complexes sometimes collapsing without direct hits as their supporting structures succumbed to cumulative stress. Atmospheric effects from the bombardment created their own hazards. Dust clouds from pulverized ferrocrete and soil hung in the air for weeks, reducing visibility to meters and clogging filtration systems. Chemical compounds released from ruptured storage facilities, or created through the interaction of explosives with industrial materials, formed toxic fogs that pooled in low-lying areas. Electrical storms, triggered by the massive energy releases from bombardment and the particulate-laden atmosphere, generated lightning that could disable communications or ignite leaked promethium from damaged vehicles. The Death Korps adapted to these conditions with characteristic efficiency. Specialized engineering units constructed covered approaches that protected advancing troops from both enemy fire and environmental hazards. Pontoon bridges and amphibious vehicles allowed movement across the growing number of toxic craters, while modified chimera transports with enhanced filtration systems could move through chemical fog banks that would have killed unprotected troops in minutes. As the breakthrough operations expanded into multiple sectors, the Death Korps continued to advance their siege lines with methodical precision. Each position taken was immediately fortified and connected to the existing network, creating a steadily constricting noose around the inner defensive ring. The specialized units, Death Riders, Grenadiers, and armored formations, continued to exploit weaknesses created by the relentless bombardment, while the regular siege regiments consolidated these gains with their characteristic thoroughness. The defenders, increasingly fragmented and isolated, found their situation deteriorating rapidly. Cut off from central command by the Death Riders' raids on communication hubs, many units were reduced to fighting independent actions with diminishing supplies and no prospect of relief. Some positions continued to resist with fanatical determination, their occupants transformed by chaos influence into entities that no longer required conventional sustenance or rest. Others surrendered or attempted to break out, only to find the Death Corps offering no quarter to those who had embraced the ruinous powers. The arrival of the Red Hunter's Space Marine chapter marked a significant escalation in the Imperial response to the deteriorating situation on Vraks. Their strike cruiser, the Wrath Unbowed, translated from the warp in the 11th year of the siege, its hull bearing the scars of numerous prior engagements. Unlike many Astartes chapters who maintained a degree of autonomy from Imperial authority, the Red Hunters operated in direct service to the Inquisition, their deployment signaling that the conflict had drawn the attention of the Emperor's most secretive servants. The Red Hunters established their forward base at Landing Zone Solaris, their crimson power armor standing in stark contrast to the drab grays and browns of the Death Korps regiments. Their chapter master Deamer immediately requested a strategic briefing from Lord Commander Xaphan, particularly focusing on intelligence regarding the traitor Astartes' presence. The Death Corps commander provided detailed tactical maps showing confirmed sightings of Alpha Legion, Word Bearers, and Iron Warriors elements, along with assessment reports of their operational patterns. Of particular concern were the Alpha Legion activities that had been detected with increasing frequency in the southwestern quadrant. Unlike the more overt operations of the other traitor legions, the Alpha Legion maintained their ancient doctrine of infiltration and subversion. Several Death Corps command posts had experienced unexplained communication failures, followed by precision strikes against key personnel, the hallmark of Alpha Legion operating procedures designed to decapitate enemy leadership. The Red Hunters deployed primarily as strike teams, their Thunderhawk gunships delivering tactical squads to engage identified traitor Astartes concentrations. Their first major operation targeted a Word-Bearer's ritual site in Sector 17B, where Death Corps reconnaissance had reported significant warp energy readings. 3 squads of tactical Marines supported by Devastator heavy weapons teams struck without warning, their bolters and plasma weapons tearing through the corrupted defenders before they could complete a summoning ritual that would have brought a significant demonic entity into real space. Within weeks of the Red Hunters' arrival, astropathic communications from nearby systems reported additional Space Marine forces en route to Vraks. The Dark Angels, one of the original first founding chapters, had dispatched a substantial contingent aboard their strike cruiser, Sword of Defiance. Their unexpected interest in what had previously been considered a standard, if extensive, siege operation raised questions among the Imperial command structure. The Dark Angels offered no explanation for their sudden involvement beyond a terse communication, stating they had information regarding traitor elements requiring immediate containment. The Dark Angels' force was commanded by Master Zadkiel of the 5th Company, his armor adorned with the distinctive robes and iconography of his chapter. His initial meeting with Lord Commander Xaphan and Chapter Master Deamer was brief and focused solely on tactical matters, specifically requesting all intelligence regarding Alpha Legion activities and movements. The Dark Angels commander showed little interest in the broader strategic situation or the Death Corps' painstaking advances, concerning himself exclusively with locating and engaging the traitor Astartes. More surprising was the arrival, within days, of 3 additional Space Marine forces, the Angels of Absolution, Angels of Redemption, and Angels of Vengeance. These unforgiven chapters, successors to the Dark Angels created during the Second Founding, coordinated their operations closely with their progenitor chapter while maintaining minimal communication with other Imperial forces. Their combined strength represented a significant Astartes presence, with over 500 Space Marines now deployed across the Vraksian battlefront. The Dark Angels and their successor chapters established a separate command structure from the existing Imperial forces, operating from their own forward bases and conducting independent operations with minimal advance notification to Death Korps commanders. This created occasional friction, particularly when Dark Angels strike teams would appear without warning in zones scheduled for artillery bombardment, forcing last-minute cancellation of fire missions that had been planned for days. The tactical approach employed by the Dark Angels differed markedly from both the methodical advance of the Death Korps and the surgical strikes favored by the Red Hunters. Master Zadokil deployed his forces according to an ancient doctrine specifically designed to counter traitor Astartes, a combined arms approach that leveraged the unique capabilities of specialized units against the known weaknesses of their corrupted brethren. Ravenwing squadrons on their black bikes served as the vanguard of Dark Angels operations, their speed allowing them to range far ahead of the main force to locate enemy concentrations. These reconnaissance elements operated in silence, using secure Vox channels and pre-arranged signal patterns rather than standard Imperial communication protocols. When they located traitor Astartes' positions, they would mark the targets with specialized teleport homers before withdrawing to a safe distance. These homers enabled the most feared element of the Dark Angels' force, the Deathwing Terminators, to teleport directly into the heart of enemy positions. Clad in ancient tactical dreadnought armor of bone-white coloration, these veterans materialized amid the traitors with a distinctive crack of displaced air, their storm bolters and power fists bringing immediate devastation to their surprised foes. Each Terminator was a veteran of centuries of warfare, their armor inscribed with oaths of moment and markings denoting campaigns dating back millennia. The Deathwing's deployment against a major Alpha Legion concentration in the ruins of Vraks Secundus demonstrated the effectiveness of this approach. After Ravenwing Outriders identified a command bunker being used by Alpha Legion coordinators, 2 full squads of Deathwing Terminators teleported directly into the facility. The ensuing battle lasted less than 20 minutes, with 17 confirmed traitor Astartes kills and the capture of extensive intelligence materials, including Vox codes and operational plans that revealed additional Alpha Legion cells throughout the sector. The Angels of Absolution, operating in the eastern sectors, employed similar tactics but with greater emphasis on close-range firefights. Their tactical squads advanced in Rhino armored personnel carriers, disembarking within optimal bolter range of identified targets before laying down devastating fusillades of mass reactive shells. Their bone-colored armor with green shoulder pads made them easily distinguishable from their Dark Angels' progenitors, though their tactical doctrine remained closely aligned. The Angels of Redemption focused their operations on the northern quadrant, where Wordbearer's elements had established several ritual sites. Their approach emphasized flamers and melta-weapons, tools particularly effective against the demon-possessed and warp-corrupted entities that frequently accompanied Wordbearer's forces. Purifier squads, specialists in cleansing corrupted sites, followed the main assault forces to ensure no taint remained in areas secured by the chapter. The Angels of Vengeance deployed primarily in support of Death Korps breakthrough operations, their black armor with white details striking fear into traitor forces who had grown accustomed to facing only mortal guardsmen. Their Predator tanks and Land Raider assault transports provided armored spearheads that could punch through defensive positions that had resisted conventional attacks for months, creating openings that Death Korps forces could exploit to advance their siege lines. The coordination between these unforgiven chapters was seamless, suggesting extensive prior experience in joint operations. Company masters would meet daily in a secured command bunker, emerging with synchronized battle plans that maximized their combined effectiveness against the traitor forces. To the Death Korps commanders, accustomed to the rigid hierarchy of Imperial Guard organization, this fluid cooperation between nominally independent chapters appeared unusual but undeniably effective. As the Unforgiven operations intensified, a pattern became apparent to observant officers in the Imperial command structure. While the Dark Angels and their successors engaged traitor Astartes of all affiliations, they devoted disproportionate resources to operations against the Alpha Legion. Moreover, certain high-ranking Dark Angels displayed particular interest in capturing rather than killing specific enemy commanders, though the purpose behind these capture missions remained classified at the highest levels. The true objectives of the Dark Angels became the subject of speculation among the Red Hunters, whose close ties to the Inquisition gave them greater awareness of the chapter's secretive nature. Chapter Master Deemer noted in his personal log that Dark Angels strike teams would occasionally secure areas and deny access to all other Imperial forces, including fellow Astartes, for hours before reopening them with no explanation offered. These restricted operations invariably followed engagements with Alpha Legion forces, and often resulted in the Dark Angels extracting personnel or materials via Thunderhawk gunships with no record of their destination. Inquisitorial representatives attached to the 88th Siege Army began to take notice of these activities. Inquisitor Hezekiah Carmelus of the Ordo Malleus, ostensibly present to monitor the growing demonic presence on Vraks, redirected some of her acolytes to observe Dark Angels' operations. When Master Zadkiel became aware of this scrutiny, he requested a private meeting with the Inquisitor aboard the Sword of Defiance. What transpired during this meeting was not recorded in official channels, but afterward, Inquisitor Carmelus withdrew her observers and instructed her staff that Dark Angels' operations were beyond the purview of our current mandate. The conflict between inquisitorial authority and the Dark Angels' autonomy came to a head following the battle for Strongpoint 27A, where elements of the Angels of Redemption had engaged a significant Alpha Legion force. After securing the position, the Space Marines established a cordon that excluded even senior inquisitorial personnel. When Interrogator Fenks, acting under Inquisitor Carmelus's authority, attempted to breach this cordon citing inquisitorial prerogative, he was physically restrained by Astartes guards and held for 6 hours before being released with a formal reprimand for interfering with chapter business. This incident prompted a sealed communication from Terra, delivered by a black ship that translated briefly into the Vraks system. The contents of this communication were known only to the highest echelons of the Imperial command structure, but its effect was immediate. Inquisitorial oversight of Dark Angels' operations ceased entirely, with Inquisitor Carmelus reassigned to investigate potential corruption within the supply chains supporting the siege. With inquisitorial interference neutralized, the Dark Angels intensified their hunt for specific targets among the Alpha Legion. Interrogator chaplains, distinctive in their black armor, adorned with white skeletal iconography, began to appear more frequently in the field, often taking personal command of operations targeting suspected Legion commanders. These fearsome warriors, experts in extraction of information from the most resistant subjects, would isolate captured traitors in secured facilities where their interrogation methods could proceed without observation. The specialized anti-traitor, Astartes tactics employed by the Dark Angels proved remarkably effective across all engagement zones. Their armories contained weapons specifically designed to counter the advantages enjoyed by Chaos Space Marines, specialized ammunition that could penetrate corrupted power armor, ancient plasma weapons that operated at higher energy outputs than standard patterns, and power fields calibrated to disrupt the warp-enhanced protection of demon-infused plate. Deathwing Terminators became particularly feared by the traitor forces. Their teleport-based assault doctrine allowed no time for preparation or retreat, while their tactical dreadnought armor rendered them virtually impervious to all but the heaviest anti-tank weapons. A single Deathwing squad could neutralize traitor elements that had resisted Death Korps assaults for weeks, their storm bolters and power fists bringing the Emperor's judgment with terrible efficiency. The most significant engagement came in the 12th year of the siege, when combined Unforgiven forces launched Operation Silent Judgment against a major Alpha Legion stronghold in the ruins of what had once been Vraks' primary communications array. Intelligence gathered from captured traitors indicated that a high-value target, referred to in intercepted communications only as the Hooded One, had established a command center within the heavily fortified complex. The operation began with a diversionary attack by Death Korps armored formations against the stronghold's southern approach, drawing defensive fire and attention away from the primary assault vector. As the traitors focused on repelling this apparent main thrust, Ravenwing squadrons infiltrated the northern perimeter, neutralizing sentries with silent weapons before placing teleport homers at strategic locations throughout the complex. The main assault commenced with simultaneous teleportation of 12 Deathwing Terminator squads directly into the heart of the Alpha Legion position. The sudden appearance of these elite warriors within their supposedly secure stronghold threw the traitors into momentary confusion, a fatal hesitation exploited by the Dark Angels with characteristic efficiency. Bolter fire echoed through the corridors as the Terminators advanced in perfect formation, their overlapping fields of fire leaving no angle uncovered. Supporting this main thrust, the Angels of Vengeance deployed land raiders carrying tactical squads against the eastern entrance, their assault cannons clearing defensive positions with devastating bursts of high-caliber shells. The Angels of Absolution secured the western approaches, preventing reinforcement or escape, while the Angels of Redemption established a perimeter to intercept any traitors attempting to flee the collapsing position. The battle lasted just under 3 hours, resulting in the confirmed elimination of 47 Alpha Legion Astartes and the capture of 9 others, including an individual believed to be the Hooded One. These prisoners were immediately transferred to the Sword of Defiance under heavy guard, with no communication permitted between them and any non-Unforgiven personnel. The Dark Angels reported the operation as a complete success, though they declined to provide specific details regarding the intelligence value of their captives or the materials recovered from the stronghold. In the aftermath of Operation Silent Judgment, the Dark Angels' focus appeared to shift. Having secured their primary objective, they redeployed their forces to support the broader Imperial advance, with greater emphasis on engaging Word-Bearers and Iron Warriors elements that posed the most immediate threat to the Death Korps' breakthrough operations. This change in priority suggested that whatever specific individuals they had sought among the Alpha Legion had either been captured or confirmed killed during their targeted operations. The impact of the Unforgiven intervention extended beyond their direct military contributions. The presence of first founding Astartes and their successor chapters provided a significant morale boost to the Imperial Guard forces, who had endured 12 years of grinding siege warfare with little visible progress toward their ultimate objective. The sight of Deathwing Terminators striding implacably through artillery barrages or Ravenwing bikers sweeping aside traitor ambushes reminded the Death Korps that they fought alongside the Emperor's finest warriors in a cause deemed worthy of Astartes' intervention. The earth trembled beneath the boots of the Death Korps infantry as they advanced through the shattered remains of Defense Line Secundus. What began as a distant rumble grew into a rhythmic pounding that veteran siege officers immediately recognized. Commissar Tyborg of the 158th Siege Regiment raised his magnoculars and confirmed their worst fears, the silhouette of a Chaos Titan emerging through the toxic mist that perpetually shrouded the inner defensive rings of Vraks. The first confirmed sighting of traitor Titan forces came in the 13th year of the siege, as the Death Korps pushed through breaches in the secondary defensive line. Scout elements from the 291st Reconnaissance Regiment reported contact with what they initially believed to be a damaged Night Walker. The reality proved far more terrifying, a Warhound-class Scout Titan bearing the defiled insignia of the Legio Vulcanum II, its once proud machine spirit, now a twisted, demonic presence that hungered for Imperial blood. Legio Vulcanum II, known in ancient records as the Lords of Ruin, had fallen to chaos during the Horus Heresy, their god machines corrupted along with their princeps. Unlike their loyalist counterparts whose titans represented the pinnacle of Imperial engineering and martial nobility, these traitor engines had been transformed by millennia in the Eye of Terror. Their adamantium hulls had warped into organic-seeming forms with bone protrusions and flayed skin stretched across their carapaces. Viewports glowed with baleful internal fires rather than the controlled plasma reactors of loyal titans, while their weapon systems had mutated into grotesque approximations of their original forms. The first warhound, designated Soul Reaver by Death Korps intelligence, emerged from the toxic fog banks surrounding Artillery Fortress Epsilon 19. Standing approximately 15 meters tall, small by Titan standards, but a colossus compared to Imperial tanks, it moved with a predatory grace that belied its massive size. Its Vulcan megabolter swept across the forward positions of the 143rd Siege Regiment, each massive shell detonating with the force of a small artillery piece and turning hardened bunkers into slaughterhouses. Lord Commander Xaphan immediately redirected artillery assets to counter this new threat, but conventional Earthshaker rounds merely scorched the Titan's void shields without penetrating. The Death Korps' heaviest weapons, basilisks and medusas, concentrated fire on the Scout Titan, yet even direct hits from siege cannons merely staggered the war machine momentarily before it continued its advance, crushing retreating guardsmen beneath its massive feet. Only the intervention of a Shadow Sword super heavy tank from the 61st Armored Regiment managed to halt the Warhound's progress. The massive tank, specifically designed for Titan hunting, fired its volcano cannon at extreme range, the beam of energy momentarily connecting the two war machines before the Titan's void shield finally collapsed under the sustained assault. A second shot penetrated the Warhound's right leg assembly, causing it to stumble and expose a vulnerability in its reactor shielding. The third and final shot struck this weakness directly, resulting in a catastrophic plasma containment failure that consumed the Titan in a miniature sun, leaving nothing but a blackened crater and scattered, twisted debris. The Death Korps' momentary victory proved short-lived. Within days, long-range auger arrays detected multiple massive power signatures advancing from the inner defensive rings. Reconnaissance flights confirmed the Imperial commander's worst fears. A full battle group of traitor Titans had been committed to the defense of Vraks. Picked captures showed at least 6 Warhound-class Scout Titans, accompanied by 3 of the more powerful Reaver-class Battle Titans, their corrupted forms advancing in loose formation toward the areas where Imperial forces had made the most significant breakthroughs. Most concerning was the presence of a single Warlord-class Titan at the center of this formation. Standing over 30 meters tall, this behemoth, identified by intelligence officers as Ferrum Dominus, had once been a proud engine of the Legio Vulcanum before its fall to chaos. Now it strode across the battlefield as a twisted parody of its former glory, its head replaced by a demon-faced helm with horns that crackled with warp energy. Its weapon systems had been augmented with demonic entities that caused its volcano cannon to fire streams of what appeared to be souls rather than energy, while its massive power claw leaked a substance that resembled blood but corroded anything it touched. The deployment of traitor Titans represented a critical escalation that threatened to unravel years of hard-won Imperial progress. The Death Korps' methodical advance had not accounted for facing god machines on the field, and their heaviest assets, Baneblades and Shadow Swords, were too few and too widely dispersed to counter this concentrated Titan force. Lord Commander Xaphan immediately dispatched an emergency astropathic message to Segmentum Command, requesting urgent Mechanicus support to counter the traitor Titan threat. The Adeptus Munitorum responded with unprecedented speed, recognizing the existential threat these war machines posed to the entire Vraks campaign. Within 3 weeks, the first elements of Legio Astorum, the Warp Runners, translated into the system aboard the massive Mechanicus transport, Omnissiah's Bounty. Their arrival brought immediate hope to the beleaguered Imperial forces, as the distinctive blue and yellow heraldry of loyal Titans appeared on the landing fields of Base Primaris. The Legio Astorum deployment included 8 Warhound Scout Titans, 4 Reaver Battle Titans, and 2 Warlord Battle Titans, a substantial force that represented a significant commitment from the Mechanicus. Each god machine bore the scars of numerous prior campaigns, their hulls adorned with kill markings and honor banners that testified to centuries of loyal service. Their princeps were veterans who had faced traitor engines before, their minds linked to machine spirits that remembered the horrors of the Horus Heresy and hungered for vengeance against their corrupted kin. Preparation for Titan warfare required substantial logistical adjustments. Massive Prometheum pipelines were established to supply the voracious plasma reactors that powered these god machines. Ammunition manufactorums worked at maximum capacity to produce the specialized ordnance required by their weapon systems. Volcano cannon power cells the size of Chimera transports, shells for turbo laser destructors that required special handling equipment, and the massive rockets used by Apocalypse missile launchers that each contained enough explosive force to level city blocks. The first engagement between loyal and traitor Titans occurred in the shattered ruins of Vraks Manufactorum District Alpha. Two warhounds of Legio Astorum, Swift Vengeance and Emperor's Wrath, encountered a single Chaos Reaver-designated Soul Harvester that had been terrorizing Death Korps positions for days. The Loyalist Titans employed classic pincer tactics, using their superior speed to flank the larger engine while avoiding its devastating weapon systems. The battle demonstrated the fundamental differences between loyal and traitor war machines. The Legio Astorum warhounds moved with precision and coordination, their princeps executing textbook maneuvers developed over millennia of Imperial tactical doctrine. In contrast, the Chaos Reaver fought with savage fury but limited strategic awareness, its corrupted machine spirit driven more by bloodlust than tactical calculation. This difference proved decisive when Swift Vengeance managed to circle behind the traitor engine and target its plasma reactor, housing with concentrated fire from its turbo laser destructor, creating a breach that Emperor's Wrath exploited with a perfectly timed volley from its volcano cannon. The destruction of the Chaos Reaver boosted Imperial morale, but the main traitor Titan force continued to advance toward the critical junction where 3 Death Korps breakthrough corridors converged. If this position fell, years of progress would be undone, as the traitors could drive a wedge between Imperial forces and potentially surround isolated elements of the siege army. Recognizing this threat, Princeps Seniorus Daedalus of Legio Astorum committed his entire battle group to a decisive engagement in what would become known as the Battle of Mortuary Ridge. The Imperial plan leveraged the superior coordination of the Loyalist Titans while accounting for their numerical disadvantage. The 2 Warlord Titans, Invictus antagonists and Dominant Will, would anchor the center of the Imperial line, their void shields and massive firepower creating a bulwark against which the traitor forces would break. The Reavers would form a second line, ready to exploit any vulnerabilities in the enemy formation, while the nimble Warhounds would operate on the flanks, preventing encirclement and striking at exposed traitor engines when opportunities arose. Supporting this Titan battle group, the Death Korps deployed their entire super heavy tank reserve, 17 Baneblades and Shadow Swords spread across the projected battlefield. While individually no match for a Titan, these massive tanks could threaten the smaller traitor engines, or at least force them to divert attention and firepower away from the Loyalist Titans. Artillery regiments established pre-sighted fire zones across the battlefield, ready to provide suppressive bombardment to disrupt traitor formations or cover tactical withdrawals if necessary. The battle began at dawn, with the traitor Titans advancing through a wall of artillery fire that did little to impede their progress, but created a churning fog of dust and smoke that reduced visibility to near zero. Through this artificial murk, the corrupted war machines emerged like ancient monsters from primordial mist, their weapon systems already tracking for targets as augur returns revealed the Imperial battle line. Ferrum Dominus, the massive traitor warlord, directed its first salvo at Invictus antagonists, the plasma stream from its modified volcano cannon striking the Loyalist Titans' void shields with such force that the energy discharge was visible from orbit. The Loyalist warlord staggered under the impact, but held its position, returning fire with methodical precision. Its princeps, a veteran of over 3 centuries of service, maintained perfect composure as he directed each weapon system individually, targeting specific vulnerabilities in the traitor engine's corrupted form rather than wasting energy on its strongest points. The engagement quickly devolved into multiple smaller duels as Titans sought worthy opponents across the battlefield. The Legio Astorum Reaver Implacable Justice found itself engaged with 2 traitor warhounds simultaneously, using its superior firepower to keep them at bay, while its princeps calculated the optimal moment to commit to destroying one at the cost of exposing itself to the other. This moment came when one of the traitor engines suffered a momentary plasma fluctuation that weakened its void shields. Implacable justice immediately directed all weapons against this target, its Gatling blaster firing thousands of armor-piercing rounds per minute that found the gaps in the traitor warhound's corrupted hull, while its melta cannon delivered the killing blow directly to the exposed reactor housing. On the eastern flank, Death Korps shadow swords worked in concert with Legio Astorum warhounds, the super heavy tanks advancing under the cover of the Scout Titan's void shields before breaking formation to deliver devastating volcano cannon shots against traitor engines already engaged with the Loyalist Titans. This coordination between Imperial Guard and Mechanicus forces represented a level of tactical integration rarely seen, testament to the desperate nature of the battle, and the recognition by both forces that only through perfect cooperation could they hope to counter the traitor Titan threat. The tide turned when Dominant Will, the second Loyalist warlord, executed a daring tactical maneuver that exposed its flank momentarily, but allowed it to target the plasma containment systems of a traitor Reaver. The resulting explosion created a cascading failure that damaged two nearby traitor engines, creating a momentary gap in their formation that the Legio Astorum forces exploited with characteristic efficiency. Three Loyalist warhounds surged through this opening, circling behind the traitor battle line to target the more vulnerable rear armor of the larger engines. The climax of the battle came as Invictus antagonists and Ferrum Dominus engaged in direct combat at the center of the battlefield. The two massive war machines traded devastating blows at ranges so close that their void shields interfered with each other, creating crackling storms of energy that incinerated everything in their vicinity. The Loyalist warlord suffered catastrophic damage to its left arm assembly and primary carapace weapons, but its princeps maintained perfect communion with his engine's machine spirit, pushing reactor output beyond recommended safety parameters to maintain void shield integrity, while diverting all remaining power to the Titan's single functioning weapon system, a massive power fist crackling with disruptive energy fields. In a maneuver that would be studied in Mechanicus tactical academies for centuries, Invictus antagonists executed a feigned retreat that drew Ferrum Dominus into pursuit, subtly adjusting its stance to favor its undamaged right side. When the traitor warlord committed to a killing blow with its corrupted power claw, the Loyalist engine pivoted with unexpected speed, allowing the enemy's momentum to carry it past, while simultaneously driving its power fist directly into the traitor's exposed reactor housing. The resulting detonation consumed both engines in a cataclysmic explosion that created a crater half a kilometer wide and sent shockwaves that toppled buildings kilometers away. The destruction of their most powerful engine broke the traitor Titan formation. Without the coordinating presence of Ferrum Dominus, the remaining Chaos Titans reverted to individual actions, making them vulnerable to the coordinated tactics of the Legio Astorum forces. By nightfall, the Loyalists had confirmed the destruction of 7 traitor engines, with the remaining Chaos Titans retreating toward the inner defensive ring, their machine spirits seemingly cowed by the loss of their dominant alpha. The victory at Mortuary Ridge came at tremendous cost. Besides the complete loss of Invictus antagonists, 3 Loyalist warhounds had been destroyed, and every surviving Titan had suffered damage requiring extensive repairs. The Death Korps had lost 11 super heavy tanks and nearly 4,000 troops who had been caught in the crossfire between these titanic combatants. Yet strategically, the engagement had secured the breakthrough corridors and eliminated the most significant counter-attack force the defenders had deployed since the beginning of the siege. In the aftermath of the battle, Mechanicus tech priests scoured the field for salvageable components from both loyal and traitor Titans. The recovery of even damaged weapon systems or armor plates represented an irreplaceable resource, while the retrieval of fallen princeps, those whose bodies and mind impulse units remained intact enough for potential recovery, was treated as a sacred duty by their surviving comrades. the first inquisitorial presence on Vraks arrived with little fanfare in the 13th year of the siege. 3 unmarked shuttles descended to landing zone Solaris, their black hulls bearing no insignia save the stylized Eye of the Holy Ordos that was recognized and feared throughout the Imperium. The Death Korps command staff had received only minimal warning of their arrival, a terse astropathic message stating that representatives of the Ordo Malleus would be conducting operations relevant to the security of the sector. Inquisitor Hezekiah Carmelis stepped onto Vraksian soil with a retinue that reflected the gravity of her mission. Flanking her were 2 power-armored figures from the chamber militant of the Ordo Malleus, Grey Knights Terminators, whose silver armor gleamed incongruously amidst the perpetual gloom of Vraks. Their presence alone signified that the siege had evolved beyond a simple suppression of heresy into something far more dangerous. The Grey Knights never deployed except to counter the most serious demonic threats, and their appearance on Vraks confirmed the worst fears of those Imperial commanders aware of their significance. Behind the Terminators came Carmelis's personal cadre, sanctioned psychers wearing psychic hoods that dampened their connection to the warp, savants carrying data slates containing classified intelligence on chaos manifestations, and combat servitors equipped with specialized weapons designed to harm entities that existed partially outside normal reality. The Inquisitor herself cut an imposing figure despite her unassuming stature. Her face bore the scars of numerous encounters with the enemies of humanity, while her eyes held the haunted look common to those who had witnessed the true nature of the warp and survived with their sanity intact. Lord Commander Zwaikal received the inquisitorial party in his command bunker, a Spartan facility 20 meters beneath the surface that served as the nerve center for the entire siege operation. The meeting was brief and focused entirely on practicalities. Carmelis requested access to all intelligence regarding suspected demonic activity, authorization to deploy her forces anywhere within Imperial-controlled territory without prior notification, and the establishment of a secure facility for conducting specialized interrogations and examinations of contaminated materials. Zwaikal, a pragmatic officer who recognized inquisitorial authority even if he didn't welcome its implications, granted these requests without argument. The Death Korps commander had seen enough during the 13-year siege to understand that conventional military approaches were insufficient against certain threats. If the Inquisition believed their specialized expertise was required, he would facilitate their operations while continuing to focus on his primary objective, the methodical reduction of Cardinal Xaphan's fortress. The inquisitorial facility, designated Containment Site Sigma, was established in a captured munitions bunker 5 kilometers behind the front lines. Death Korps engineers reinforced the structure according to specifications provided by Carmelis's tech adepts, installing specialized containment fields, warp disruption generators, and purification systems designed to prevent contamination from spreading beyond the facility's walls. Within days, the site was operational, its entrance guarded by Grey Knights, whose vigilance ensured that nothing entered or left without inquisitorial authorization. The first major inquisitorial operation coincided with the Death Korps assault on defensive line Tertius Sector 12 Alpha. As Krieg guardsmen breached the outer perimeter of a major strongpoint, they encountered resistance unlike anything they had faced previously. Survivors reported defending forces that shifted between human and inhuman forms, weapons that fired projectiles that screamed in recognizable voices, and localized reality distortions that caused some attackers to age decades in seconds, while others reverted to childhood before disintegrating entirely. Inquisitor Carmelis arrived at the forward command post within hours of these reports, reaching Lord Commander Zwaikal. After reviewing the tactical data and interviewing several officers who had observed the phenomena, she declared the entire sector under inquisitorial quarantine. Death Korps forces were ordered to establish a cordon around the affected area, but prohibited from further advance pending specialized intervention. The Grey Knights deployed that night, teleporting directly into the contested strongpoint from their strike cruiser, Emperor's Light, in high orbit. What transpired within the quarantine zone remained classified at the highest level, but Death Korps observation posts reported continuous flashes of silver-blue light visible even through the thick smoke of battle, while seismographic equipment registered energy discharges consistent with force weapon detonations of extraordinary magnitude. 36 hours later, the Grey Knights emerged from the strongpoint. Their once gleaming armor was now scorched and pitted, bearing the marks of combat against entities that conventional weapons could barely harm. They carried with them several sealed containers, whose contents emitted radiation patterns that caused nearby Auspex units to malfunction. These containers were immediately transported to Containment Site Sigma under heavy guard, their contents never revealed to even the highest-ranking Death Korps officers. Following this operation, inquisitorial presence expanded rapidly across the Vraksian front. Acolytes of the Ordo Malleus established monitoring stations at key points along the Imperial advance, their specialized equipment designed to detect warp fluctuations that might indicate imminent demonic manifestation. These stations operated independently from Death Korps command structures, reporting directly to Inquisitor Carmelis and bypassing the traditional military chain of command. The relationship between inquisitorial forces and the Death Korps remained professional but distant. The guardsmen of Krieg, indoctrinated from birth to view death in the Emperor's service as the ultimate purpose of their existence, found common ground with the Grey Knights' similar fatalism. Both forces recognized that they served as weapons against the enemies of humanity, with personal survival subordinate to mission accomplishment. This philosophical alignment facilitated cooperation in the field, even as the specifics of inquisitorial objectives remained obscured from Death Korps commanders. As the siege progressed into its 14th year, the frequency of Grey Knight deployments increased dramatically. Strike teams teleported into contested zones with growing regularity, often arriving without warning and departing just as suddenly once their objectives were secured. Death Korps officers learned to recognize the signs of impending inquisitorial intervention: unusual warp signatures detected by forward observation posts, unexplained Vox disruptions, or the distinctive atmospheric pressure changes that preceded teleportation arrivals. The most significant Grey Knight operation occurred during the assault on Artillery Fortress Diomes, a massive installation that had resisted Imperial advances for over 2 years. As Death Korps siege regiments prepared for what promised to be a costly frontal assault, Inquisitor Carmelis arrived at the forward command post with disturbing intelligence. Auspex scans had detected energy patterns within the fortress consistent with a major summoning ritual in progress, a ritual that, if completed, would bring a greater demon into real space. The response was immediate and overwhelming. 3 full squads of Grey Knight Terminators, led by Brother Captain Arven, teleported directly into the heart of the fortress, while supporting strike teams secured the perimeter to prevent the escape of cultists or the spreading of contamination. Death Korps forces were ordered to maintain their positions, but prepare for immediate advance once the inquisitorial operation concluded. The battle within Artillery Fortress Diomes lasted 7 hours, though witnesses from nearby observation posts reported that time itself seemed distorted around the structure, with chronometers malfunctioning and guardsmen experiencing subjective time at different rates depending on their proximity to the fortress. The clash between Grey Knights and whatever they confronted within produced effects visible across the entire sector: storms of unnatural lightning that struck upward from the fortress into the cloud-choked sky, momentary transparency of solid structures as reality thinned under the strain of warp energies, and psychic backlash that caused even non-psychers to experience vivid hallucinations of places they had never seen. When the Grey Knights finally emerged from the fortress, they brought with them no prisoners and no trophies, only confirmation that the threat had been neutralized at the cost of 16 battle brothers, whose remains were recovered with solemn ceremony for return to Titan. Death Korps forces occupied the fortress hours later, finding the interior transformed in ways that defied conventional explanation. Walls bore the marks of weapons that cut through adamantium as easily as flesh, while certain chambers contained perfectly spherical voids where matter had been completely annihilated. Most disturbing were the remains of the traitor forces, not merely killed but unmade, their physical forms rendered down to base components by weapons designed specifically to counter demonic entities. The aftermath of the Diome's operation marked a turning point in inquisitorial involvement on Vraks. What had begun as a monitoring mission expanded into active countermeasures against a growing demonic presence. Inquisitor Carmelus established a permanent command center at Base Primaris, staffed by acolytes from multiple Ordo Malleus cells and supported by additional Grey Knight strike teams deployed from Titan specifically for the Vraks campaign. This escalation did not go unnoticed by other factions within the Inquisition. The 15th year of the siege saw the arrival of Inquisitor Foreign Trueheart of the Ordo Hereticus, whose shuttle landed at Base Primaris without prior notification or coordination with existing inquisitorial assets. Trueheart, a tall, austere figure whose face bore the distinctive augmetic replacements favored by the more radical elements of his Ordo, came with his own retinue of black armored stormtroopers and interrogator adepts specialized in identifying and extracting confessions from suspected heretics. The conflict between the two inquisitorial factions became apparent immediately. Trueheart's first official act was to request access to Containment Site Sigma, citing his authority as an Ordo Hereticus representative to investigate potential corruption within Imperial forces. Inquisitor Carmelus denied this request, stating that the materials contained within the facility fell under Ordo Malleus jurisdiction due to their connection to demonic entities rather than simple heresy. This jurisdictional dispute, while conducted with superficial courtesy, represented a fundamental disagreement about the nature of the threat on Vraks and the appropriate response to it. For the Ordo Malleus, the primary concern was containment and neutralization of demonic incursions. Their operations focused on identifying and eliminating warp entities before they could establish a permanent foothold in real space, with the corruption of human forces considered a secondary effect rather than the root cause of the problem. The Grey Knights operated according to this philosophy, prioritizing targets based on their connection to the warp rather than their strategic significance to the overall siege. The Ordo Hereticus, by contrast, viewed the entire conflict through the lens of human corruption. To Inquisitor Trueheart, the demonic manifestations were merely symptoms of the underlying heresy that had begun with Cardinal Xaphan's rebellion. His approach emphasized identifying and purging the human networks that facilitated chaos worship, with particular attention to potential contamination within Imperial forces themselves. This methodology led to extensive interrogation of Death Korps soldiers who had encountered suspected demonic entities, searching for signs of corruption that might have taken root in their minds despite their renowned psychological resilience. The tension between these approaches came to a head following the Grey Knight's intervention at Redoubt 117, where a suspected lesser demon of Tzeentch had manifested among the defending forces. After the entity was banished by Brother Captain Arvan's strike team, Inquisitor Trueheart demanded that all Death Korps personnel who had witnessed the manifestation be remanded to Ordo Hereticus custody for examination and potential memory modification or elimination. Inquisitor Carmelus countered that such measures were unnecessary given the specific nature of the entity involved, which posed minimal risk of memetic contamination compared to certain other warp phenomena. The dispute escalated to the point where both inquisitors threatened to invoke their ultimate authority, the power to declare individuals or units excommunicate traitores. Lord Commander Zweikel, recognizing the potential for this conflict to undermine the entire war effort, requested intervention from higher authority. This came in the form of an astropathic message from Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex, a senior Ordo Malleus authority, whose experience with demonic incursions dated back to the Plague of Unbelief in the 38th millennium. Rex's directive was unambiguous. Primary jurisdiction for the Vraks campaign would remain with the Ordo Malleus due to confirmed greater demon activity, with Ordo Hereticus operations permitted only in coordination with and subordinate to Malleus authority. Inquisitor Trueheart was ordered to focus his investigations on potential corruption within the supply chains and administrative structures supporting the siege, rather than front-line units actively engaged with demonic entities. This resolution, while preventing open conflict between inquisitorial factions, did little to address the underlying philosophical disagreement. Inquisitor Trueheart established his own facility, designated Purity Center Omega, where suspected heretics identified through his intelligence network were brought for interrogation and judgment. These operations continued parallel to, but separate from the Ordo Malleus activities, creating an uncomfortable division of inquisitorial authority that many Death Korps officers found difficult to navigate. The practical impact of this division became apparent in the handling of information regarding demonic encounters. Ordo Malleus protocols emphasized containment of knowledge, with strict limitations on who could be informed about the true nature of certain enemies or phenomena. This approach often frustrated Death Korps commanders, who found themselves ordered to commit resources to objectives whose strategic significance remained unexplained. Conversely, Ordo Hereticus methods focused on identifying and eliminating potential vectors for corruption, sometimes removing experienced officers from command based on exposure to classified information rather than any actual evidence of taint. Between these competing inquisitorial approaches, a third methodology emerged that would ultimately prove most effective in the unique circumstances of Vraks. The Grey Knights, while formally aligned with the Ordo Malleus, operated according to their own ancient protocols developed specifically for campaigns involving significant demonic presence. Rather than focusing exclusively on either the demonic entities themselves or the human networks that facilitated their manifestation, the Grey Knights targeted the interface between these elements, the rituals, artifacts, and gateways that allowed warp entities to enter real space. Brother Captain Arvan's strike teams developed a pattern of operations that maximized their specialized capabilities while minimizing interference with the broader Imperial advance. Using intelligence gathered by both inquisitorial networks, they identified priority targets where demonic manifestation was either imminent or already underway. These locations were designated Malleus objectives and temporarily placed under Grey Knight authority, with Death Korps forces establishing cordons to isolate the affected areas while the Astartes dealt with the threat directly. This approach proved particularly effective during the assault on the Third Defensive Ring, where Wordbearer's Dark Apostles had established multiple summoning sites in preparation for a major ritual. Grey Knight strike teams teleported directly onto these sites in a coordinated operation, their timing synchronized to the second to ensure that all locations were hit simultaneously before the defenders could react. The precision of this attack prevented the completion of a ritual that intelligence indicated would have torn a permanent warp rift in the fabric of reality around Vraks, a catastrophe that would have rendered the entire campaign irrelevant as the planet itself became uninhabitable. The aftermath of Grey Knight operations invariably involved extensive purification procedures. Areas where demonic entities had manifested were considered contaminated not just physically, but spiritually, requiring specialized cleansing beyond the capabilities of standard Imperial forces. Chaplain Terminators performed exorcism rites over affected ground, while sanctified promethium was used to burn any organic material that might retain traces of warp influence. In cases of severe contamination, tactical nuclear devices were deployed to sterilize large areas, with the resulting radiation considered preferable to the spiritual taint that might otherwise persist. Information control following these operations represented one of the most challenging aspects of inquisitorial involvement. Death Korps guardsmen who witnessed demonic manifestations or their aftermath were processed according to a tiered system developed jointly by Inquisitors Carmelis and Trueheart. Those with minimal exposure might receive chemical treatments to induce targeted memory loss, while others underwent more invasive procedures to remove or replace traumatic recollections. In cases where contamination was deemed too extensive for safe rehabilitation, entire units were sometimes declared lost in conventional combat, their actual fate recorded only in sealed inquisitorial archives. The most severe purges occurred following the Battle of Mortuary Ridge, where the destruction of the traitor Titans had released massive amounts of warp energy into the surrounding area. Death Korps units that had been positioned closest to the detonation of Ferrum Dominus reported phenomena that defied rational explanation, soldiers whose shadows moved independently of their bodies, Vox units that broadcast conversations from decades earlier or years in the future, and wounds that bled in reverse, drawing ambient liquid into the body rather than releasing it. The 17th year of the siege dawned with a blood-red sunrise barely visible through Vraks' polluted atmosphere. What had once been a strategically vital Imperial fortress world now resembled a vision of hell itself, continents scarred by artillery barrages, oceans poisoned by chemical runoff, and the air so toxic that even the Death Korps veterans with their sophisticated rebreathers suffered respiratory damage after prolonged exposure. Lord Commander Zweikel stood atop observation post Delta 7, surveying the final defensive ring through magnoculars. His face, weathered by 17 years of commanding the longest siege in recent Imperial history, betrayed no emotion as he studied the approaching storm front, both meteorological and military. The inner citadel of Vraks, Cardinal Xaphan's final stronghold, rose from the blasted landscape like a malevolent monument to hubris and heresy. Its massive void shields shimmered with unnatural energies, while defense lasers tracked across the sky, searching for Imperial aircraft that might venture too close. The final push toward the inner citadel represented the culmination of the most resource-intensive siege operation mounted by Imperial forces in the Scaris sector for millennia. What had begun as a straightforward mission to remove a heretical cardinal had evolved into something far more sinister, a full-scale war against the forces of chaos that had taken root on Vraks like a malignant infection. The combined Imperial forces now arrayed against the inner citadel dwarfed even the substantial forces that had begun the siege. Death Korps regiments formed the backbone of the assault, their numbers replenished countless times over the years as casualties mounted. The 158th and 143rd Siege Regiments, having fought since the initial landings, retained only a handful of veterans who had witnessed the campaign's beginning. These soldiers, their greatcoats patched and repatched, their respirator masks modified with additional filtration layers to handle Vraks' increasingly toxic atmosphere, moved with the mechanical precision that only 17 years of constant warfare could instill. Supporting the Death Korps came elements from multiple Space Marine chapters. The Red Hunters maintained their presence, their crimson armor now bearing the scars of 6 years of continuous operations against the forces of chaos. The Dark Angels and their successor chapters had withdrawn the bulk of their forces after securing their mysterious objectives, but a contingent remained, primarily Ravenwing units whose speed and firepower provided crucial mobile support for the plotting Death Korps' advance. New to the battlefield were companies from the Angels of Absolution and Flesh Terrors chapters, their distinctive liveries bringing fresh terror to the defenders. The Flesh Terrors, notorious for their savagery in combat, specialized in shock assaults that broke enemy formations through sheer violence and momentum. Their presence represented a significant shift in Imperial strategy, from the methodical grinding advance that had characterized most of the siege to a more aggressive approach, intended to overwhelm the final defenses before the traitors could further consolidate their position. Inquisitorial forces had also expanded significantly as the true nature of the conflict became apparent. Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex himself had arrived to take personal command of the Ordo Malleus operations, bringing with him additional Grey Knight strike teams and specialized equipment designed specifically for combating demonic entities. His command center, established in a heavily fortified bunker, complex 5 kilometers behind the front lines, housed technologies rarely seen outside the most sensitive inquisitorial facilities, psychic dampening fields, warp signature detection arrays, and containment systems capable of holding entities that existed partially outside conventional reality. The tactical situation facing this assembled force presented challenges beyond those of conventional siege warfare. The inner citadel's defenses had been designed by the finest military architects of the Imperium, then corrupted and enhanced by the technical expertise of the Iron Warriors and the warp craft of the Word Bearers. Multiple rings of ferrocrete bunkers, each housing heavy weapons and protected by void shield generators, surrounded the central fortress. Between these rings stretched killing grounds covered by interlocking fields of fire, where advancing troops would find no cover from the devastating firepower that could be brought to bear against them. More concerning than these conventional defenses were the reality distortions that had begun to manifest around the inner citadel. Auspex readings showed fluctuating energy patterns that defied standard Imperial classification, while scout units reported visual anomalies that suggested the barrier between real space and the warp had grown dangerously thin. Certain approaches to the fortress appeared to loop back on themselves, with reconnaissance teams finding themselves returning to their starting points despite maintaining consistent direction. Other areas exhibited temporal inconsistencies, with Vox transmissions arriving before they were sent or objects aging decades in minutes. Lord Commander Zweikel's final assault plan, developed in consultation with the assembled Space Marine captains and inquisitorial representatives, reflected these unique challenges. Rather than a single massive advance across all sectors, the plan called for multiple coordinated thrusts targeting specific weaknesses identified through months of observation and intelligence gathering. Each thrust would be spearheaded by Space Marine units, whose enhanced physiology and warp-resistant indoctrination made them better suited to withstand the reality distortions near the Citadel, with Death Korps formations following to secure and hold territory gained. The most critical element of the plan involved the neutralization of the void shield generators protecting the inner citadel. These massive devices, housed in armored bunkers at 4 equidistant points around the fortress, prevented effective bombardment of the central structures and would need to be disabled before the final assault could proceed. This task fell to specialized strike teams composed of Death Korps combat engineers supported by Space Marine veterans, each team equipped with melta charges capable of breaching the generator's protective casings. The assault began with the most intensive artillery barrage of the entire 17-year campaign. Every available gun in the Imperial arsenal opened fire simultaneously, from the humble 120 mortars of Death Korps infantry companies to the massive Earthshaker batteries that had been the workhorses of the siege. Basilisk self-propelled artillery platforms, their barrels elevated to maximum range, fired in coordinated salvos that sent thousands of high-explosive shells arcing toward the outer defenses of the inner citadel. Joining this conventional barrage came the specialized munitions of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Phosphex bombs, their contents burning with an unquenchable chemical fire that consumed oxygen and organic matter with equal veracity, targeted ammunition dumps and barracks areas. Vortex missiles, carrying warheads that momentarily tore holes in the fabric of reality itself, were directed against the most heavily armored bunkers, their exotic energies bypassing physical protection to consume matter from within. From orbit, Navy vessels added their firepower to the bombardment. Lance strikes from the battleship Eternal Vigilance carved glowing furrows across the defensive perimeter, while macro-cannon batteries saturated target zones with shells the size of small buildings. This orbital fire focused particularly on anti-aircraft emplacements, suppressing them to allow the deployment of Imperial aircraft that would support the ground assault. The bombardment continued for 72 hours without pause, the constant thunder of explosions becoming the heartbeat of the battlefield. When it finally ceased, the sudden silence seemed almost more disorienting to Imperial troops than the noise had been. Through the settling dust and smoke, the inner citadel remained standing, its void shields flickering but intact, though the outermost defensive ring had been reduced to scattered rubble interspersed with craters deep enough to swallow Chimera transports whole. The ground assault commenced at dawn, with Thunderhawk gunships delivering Space Marine strike teams to their designated insertion points, while Death Korps armored columns advanced along cleared routes through the minefields. The Red Hunters targeted the northern approach, their tactical doctrine emphasizing coordinated fire and movement to suppress enemy positions. The Flesh Terrors took the southern sector, their assault more direct and visceral, with chainsword-wielding assault squads charging directly into enemy strongpoints with a fury that shocked even veteran Death Korps observers. The Death Korps themselves advanced in their characteristic formation, infantry moving in dispersed squads that utilized every scrap of cover, supported by Leman Russ battle tanks and Hellhound flame tanks that targeted bunkers and trench systems. Their progress was methodical but relentless, each position taken immediately fortified and used as a base for the next advance. Casualties mounted at a rate that would have broken the morale of any conventional guard regiment, but the Death Korps pressed forward with the fatalistic determination that had become their hallmark over the long years of the siege. The most significant resistance came at the Void Shield generator complexes, where the defenders had concentrated their elite forces. At Generator Complex Alpha, a Death Korps assault team encountered Word-Bearer's Terminators, whose armor had been enhanced with demonic sigils that flared with unnatural light when struck by Law's fire. The ensuing battle devolved into room-by-room clearing operations, with Krieg Grenadiers using melta-bombs to breach walls rather than attempting to force heavily defended doorways. Despite suffering over 70% casualties, the assault team eventually reached the generator's control room, where combat engineers placed their demolition charges, while the remaining infantry held off waves of counter-attacking cultists. Generator Complex Beta fell to a combined force of Red Hunter's Tactical Marines and Death Korps heavy weapons teams. The Space Marines breached the outer defenses using crack missiles to create entry points, then secured a perimeter, while specialized Death Korps demolition experts advanced to the generator itself. The defenders, primarily Iron Warriors with supporting cultist units, contested every meter, transforming the complex's narrow corridors into killing grounds where dozens died for the gain of a single room. The generator was finally disabled by a suicide attack from a critically wounded Death Korps lieutenant, who manually detonated his melta charges after conventional remote detonators failed due to warp interference. The most difficult target proved to be Generator Complex Delta, where reality itself seemed to fight against the Imperial advance. Flesh Terror's assault marines reported corridors that extended impossibly when traversed, rooms that contained the same defenders no matter how many times they were cleared, and wounds that leaked clockwork mechanisms rather than blood. Only the intervention of a Grey Knight strike team, teleporting directly into the generator chamber with specialized null field generators, allowed the complex to be neutralized after 9 hours of continuous fighting. With 3 of the 4 generator complexes disabled, the void shields protecting the inner citadel began to fail unevenly, creating localized weaknesses that Imperial forces immediately exploited. Orbital lance strikes targeted the exposed sections of the fortress, while Marauder bombers conducted precision bombing runs against command and control nodes identified by intelligence assets. The remaining generator, while still functional, could not maintain the integrity of the entire shield network, resulting in cascading failures that eventually left the central fortress completely exposed. The final push toward Cardinal Xaphan's personal stronghold within the inner citadel revealed the most disturbing aspect of the entire campaign. Intelligence gathered by inquisitorial agents had suggested that the Cardinal himself had not been seen in person for several years, with all communications coming through intermediaries or pre-recorded messages. As Imperial forces breached the inner sanctum, they discovered the truth behind this absence. Cardinal Xaphan was already dead, his desiccated corpse seated upon a throne of fused human remains in the central chamber of the fortress. Inquisitorial psychers, scanning the area for warp signatures, determined that Xaphan had likely died years earlier, possibly as early as the 5th year of the siege. More disturbing was the evidence that his identity had been assumed by an Alpha Legion operative identified as Lord Arcos, who had used the Cardinal's authority to transform what began as a simple rebellion into a full-scale chaos incursion. This deception explained the sophisticated tactics employed by the defenders, and the coordination between various traitor Astartes elements that had appeared on Vraks. The revelation of Arcos' deception came too late to prevent the trap he had prepared for the Imperial assault forces. As the combined Death Korps and Space Marine units secured the central fortress, automated systems triggered a series of plasma reactors buried deep beneath the structure. The resulting chain reaction threatened to destroy not just the fortress, but a significant portion of the surrounding battlefield, potentially crippling the Imperial force at the moment of their apparent victory. Only the sacrifice of a full squad of Grey Knight Terminators prevented catastrophe. Teleporting directly into the reactor chamber, they established a containment field using their own psychic abilities, channeling the explosion's energy into the warp rather than allowing it to devastate the material realm. The psychic backlash from this act was felt by sensitive individuals across the entire planet, while the physical toll reduced the reactor complex to a glassy crater nearly a kilometer across. In the aftermath of the reactor containment, Imperial forces secured the remainder of the inner citadel against sporadic resistance from isolated pockets of defenders. Most of the traitor Astartes had withdrawn before the final assault, using the hidden tunnel networks beneath the fortress to escape with valuable artifacts and information. Lord Arcos himself eluded capture, though inquisitorial forces recovered substantial intelligence regarding his operations and potential future targets from data vaults within the Cardinal's private quarters. The tactical innovations that finally broke the 17-year stalemate reflected both the accumulated experience of the Imperial forces and their adaptation to the unique challenges of Vraks. The coordination between different Imperial organizations, Death Korps regiments, multiple Space Marine chapters, inquisitorial assets, and Navy elements represented a level of integration rarely achieved in Imperial military operations. Each force contributed according to its strengths. The Death Korps provided the unrelenting pressure and willingness to sustain casualties that wore down the defenders over years of siege warfare. The Space Marines delivered the precise application of overwhelming force at critical points. The Inquisition contained and countered the warp-based threats that conventional forces could not address. As the dust settled over the blasted wasteland that had once been the inner citadel of Vraks Prime, the true scale of devastation became apparent. 17 years of unrelenting warfare had transformed a vital Imperial fortress world into an unrecognizable hellscape. The final Imperial push had secured victory, but what remained could scarcely be called a triumph. The planet that Lord Commander Xaphan surveyed from his command salamander was no longer the strategic asset the Imperium had fought so long to reclaim. Krieg quartermasters, methodical as ever, began the grim accounting of the campaign's cost. The Death Korps alone had lost over 14 million soldiers since the first landings 17 years earlier. Entire regiments had been wiped out and reconstituted multiple times, their regimental standards bearing campaign honors that represented incalculable sacrifice. The 158th Siege Regiment, one of the first to make planetfall, had suffered 94% casualties over the course of the siege, with only 412 of its original soldiers still alive to witness the campaign's end. Equipment losses proved equally staggering. Over 9,000 armored vehicles had been destroyed or damaged beyond repair, from nimble Centaur light carriers to mighty Baneblade super heavy tanks. Artillery pieces numbered in the tens of thousands, many having fired so many rounds that their barrels had been replaced dozens of times before the vehicles themselves were lost to enemy action. The munitions expenditure figures defied comprehension: over 1.2 billion artillery shells of various calibers, enough to have supplied multiple sector-wide campaigns of more conventional duration. The Adeptus Munitorum representatives, arriving to assess the status of the world's once vast stockpiles, found their task largely pointless. Of the strategic supplies that had made Vraks worth defending, almost nothing remained salvageable. Ammunition bunkers had been emptied to supply both sides of the conflict or destroyed in the fighting. Vehicle parks contained only burnt-out husks. Promethium reservoirs had been detonated as defensive measures or tapped dry to fuel 17 years of mechanized warfare. Beyond the material losses, the environmental damage to Vraks Prime represented perhaps the most permanent consequence of the prolonged conflict. The atmosphere, already marginal before the war, had deteriorated to the point that Imperial assessment teams required full environmental suits even in the least affected regions. Toxicity levels in the soil exceeded Imperial safety standards by factors of thousands, with concentrations of heavy metals, radioactive isotopes, and chemical weapon residue that would render agriculture impossible for centuries. The water table had been contaminated beyond any practical means of remediation. What had once been subsurface aquifers now consisted of a toxic soup containing everything from promethium derivatives to the decaying remnants of chemical weapons. In some locations, water drawn from wells spontaneously combusted upon contact with air, while in others it contained enough dissolved metal to conduct electricity efficiently. Most concerning to the Ordo Malleus assessment teams were the areas of persistent warp contamination. Certain battlefields, particularly those where significant demonic manifestations had occurred, exhibited alarming signs of reality distortion even months after the fighting had moved elsewhere. Vegetation that grew in these zones displayed unnatural properties, colors not found in nature, growth patterns that seemed to form meaningful symbols when viewed from altitude, or physiological structures that had no evolutionary purpose but resembled organic machinery. Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex personally supervised the cataloging of these contaminated zones. His reports to Ordo Malleus headquarters recommended the most severe classification for Vraks Prime, Perdita Extremis, a designation reserved for worlds where corruption had reached levels that made reclamation impractical or inadvisable. This classification would normally lead to exterminatus proceedings, but the strategic importance of Vraks and the resources already expended in its recapture complicated the decision. The compromise solution emerged after extensive deliberation among representatives of the Inquisition, Adeptus Munitorum, and Adeptus Mechanicus. Rather than outright destruction, Vraks would be subject to indefinite quarantine, with specialized containment protocols to prevent the spread of contamination. Orbital platforms were established at key Lagrange points, equipped with weapons capable of destroying any unauthorized vessels attempting to approach or leave the planet. Ground-based monitoring stations, operated by servitors and tech priests with extensive augmetic replacements to reduce vulnerability to corruption, would maintain surveillance of the most severely affected zones. The Adeptus Mechanicus expressed particular interest in studying the long-term effects of prolonged warp exposure on material environments. Under strict inquisitorial oversight, they established research facilities in the least contaminated regions, focusing on developing improved methods for detecting and neutralizing warp-tainted materials. These facilities operated under protocols that included regular staff rotation to prevent extended exposure and mandatory psychic screening to detect early signs of contamination. For the Death Korps regiments that had fought so long to reclaim Vraks, the aftermath brought neither celebration nor recognition. In keeping with their regimental traditions, they viewed the victory not as a triumph, but merely as partial repayment of Krieg's eternal debt to the Emperor. The surviving units were immediately reassigned to new war zones across the sector, their equipment refurbished, and their ranks replenished with fresh troops from Krieg's training facilities. Lord Commander Zwakel, who had directed the siege from its first day to its last, submitted his final report to Adeptus Munitorum headquarters on Terra with characteristic brevity. The document outlined the strategic objectives achieved, resources expended, and lessons learned without a single word of self-congratulation or request for recognition. Upon transmission of this report, he requested reassignment to another campaign, unwilling to accept the period of rest typically granted to officers after extended deployments. The Space Marine chapters that had participated in the final phases of the siege departed with varying degrees of ceremony. The Red Hunters, true to their secretive nature, withdrew without formal acknowledgement, their strike cruisers translating into the warp with only the briefest of communications to Imperial command. The Flesh Terrors departed after recovering their dead, their gene seed carefully preserved for implantation into future battle brothers. The Dark Angels and their successor chapters had largely withdrawn before the final assault, having apparently secured their mysterious objectives during earlier operations. Only a small contingent remained to observe the campaign's conclusion, and these departed immediately upon confirmation of victory, taking with them several sealed containers whose contents were never disclosed to other Imperial forces. Perhaps most significant in the campaign's aftermath was the reassessment of Imperial siege doctrine prompted by the Vraks experience. The Adeptus Munitorum commissioned an extensive analysis of the operation, seeking to identify factors that had extended the conflict well beyond its initially projected 12-year timeline. This analysis, conducted by a team of strategists and logisticians with no direct involvement in the campaign, produced findings that would influence Imperial military planning for centuries to come. The report identified several critical factors that had contributed to the prolonged nature of the siege. First among these was the underestimation of Cardinal Xaphan's preparations. Intelligence assessments had failed to detect the extent of his fortification efforts or the sophistication of the defenses he had established using resources diverted from Imperial stockpiles. This highlighted the need for more comprehensive surveillance of key strategic installations and stricter oversight of high-ranking ecclesiarchy officials with access to military assets. Second was the failure to anticipate outside intervention, particularly from traitor Astartes elements. The original operational plan had treated the conflict as a straightforward suppression of rebellion rather than a potential chaos incursion, resulting in force composition and tactical approaches ill-suited to countering the threats that eventually emerged. Future planning would incorporate contingencies for escalation, with pre-designated reinforcement schedules and trigger points for requesting specialized assets such as Space Marine or Inquisitorial support. Third, and perhaps most consequential for future Imperial operations, was the assessment of the Death Korps' approach to siege warfare. While their determination and willingness to sustain casualties were acknowledged as valuable assets, the analysis suggested that their methodical, attrition-based tactics had potentially extended the conflict unnecessarily. More flexible approaches, incorporating targeted deep strikes and greater emphasis on maneuver warfare where terrain permitted, might have achieved the same objectives with fewer losses and in less time. This critique led to a broader reevaluation of specialized siege regiments within the Imperial Guard. While the Death Korps would continue to serve in their traditional role, future siege operations would more frequently incorporate elements from other regiments with complementary tactical doctrines. Kadachan jungle fighters, for instance, might be deployed to exploit weaknesses in perimeter defenses, while Elysian drop troops could secure key objectives behind enemy lines, disrupting command and control networks that supported cohesive defense. The logistical aspects of the campaign received particular scrutiny. The sheer scale of supply requirements for a 17-year siege had strained Imperial transportation networks across the entire sector, diverting resources from other potential conflict zones. Future planning would emphasize more efficient use of local resources where possible, along with the development of improved recycling technologies to reduce the constant flow of replacement materials needed to sustain extended operations. Inquisitorial assessment of the campaign focused primarily on the warp-related aspects that had emerged as the siege progressed. The gradual corruption of Vraks and its defenders represented a pattern observed in other prolonged conflicts, suggesting that extended warfare itself could thin the barrier between real space and the warp under certain conditions. This finding led to the implementation of new protocols for monitoring long-duration campaigns, with specialized Ordo Malleus assets assigned to detect early signs of warp contamination before they could develop into major incursions. The Grey Knight's involvement, while limited to specific operations targeting demonic threats, provided valuable data on the effectiveness of various containment and banishment techniques in active warzone conditions. Brother Captain Arvan's detailed after-action reports, classified at the highest levels of inquisitorial security, would inform Grey Knight's tactical doctrine for centuries to come, particularly regarding operations in environments where prolonged conflict had weakened reality's fabric. For the common citizens of the Imperium, the Vraks campaign entered historical records as simply another victory for the Emperor's forces, the details sanitized, and the true nature of the enemy obscured behind euphemisms and deliberate omissions. Preachers of the ecclesiarchy incorporated heavily modified accounts of the siege into their sermons, emphasizing the fate that awaits those who turn from the Emperor's light, while carefully avoiding any mention of the specific heresies involved or the demonic entities that had manifested. In the decades following the campaign's conclusion, Vraks Prime remained under quarantine, its status reviewed periodically by joint committees representing the Inquisition and Adeptus Munitorum. Each assessment found the contamination levels essentially unchanged, the warp-tainted zones neither expanding nor diminishing, but existing in a state of unnatural stasis. The research facilities established by the Adeptus Mechanicus continued their work, developing increasingly sophisticated methods for detecting and measuring warp contamination, though practical means of permanently cleansing affected areas remained elusive. The strategic value of Vraks, once considered worth the immense cost of the 17-year siege, diminished as Imperial military doctrine evolved. The concept of massive planetary stockpiles, vulnerable to capture or corruption, gave way to more distributed supply networks with redundant storage facilities spread across multiple systems. While this approach increased transportation requirements, it reduced the strategic impact of losing any single installation and complicated enemy attempts to target critical supply nodes. In the final analysis, the Siege of Vraks stands as both a testament to Imperial determination and a cautionary tale about the true cost of warfare in the 41st millennium. The reclamation of the planet consumed resources that might have secured a dozen other worlds, while the prize itself proved ultimately worthless, a contaminated husk that could never again serve its intended purpose. Yet the knowledge gained, particularly regarding the containment of warp contamination and the countering of demonic incursions, would save countless lives in future conflicts across the Imperium. For the Death Korps of Krieg, Vraks became another chapter in their long history of atonement through sacrifice, neither more nor less significant than dozens of other campaigns fought across the millennia. The lessons learned would be incorporated into their training, the tactics refined based on battlefield experience, but the fundamental approach remained unchanged, the methodical application of overwhelming force, regardless of cost, until victory was achieved or no soldiers remained to continue the fight. The Emperor's judgment had been delivered to Vraks Prime through 17 years of unrelenting warfare, leaving behind a world scoured by fire and forever marked by its brush with the ruinous powers. In the grim darkness of the far future, it was neither the first nor the last world to suffer such a fate, merely another casualty in humanity's eternal struggle for survival in a hostile universe.